Story number 1. Sometimes, I wonder if I'm the real Jake Morrison, or just the echo of a dying man screaming through the static. There are nights when I hear my voice begging for help from places I've never seen, trapped in trucks I've never driven, hauling things I pray aren't real. I keep driving, even when the road ahead feels like it's unraveling beneath me. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't sleep deprivation. It wasn't my imagination playing tricks on me. That night in the desert, something called out using my own voice. Same accent, same rasp, a voice filled with terror, describing horrors that didn't belong to my reality until they did. I used to think my rig was my sanctuary. Chrome and diesel, steel and silence, my peace in a chaotic world. Now, I keep looking in the rearview mirror, not to watch the road, but to make sure nothing's watching me back. The others don't talk anymore. Familiar truckers, now hollow-eyed and eerily polite, hauling sealed cargo with pulses and whispers inside. Something has changed them, and I fear it's trying to change me too. Every night at the same time, the static returns, and within it, my voice speaks secrets I shouldn't know, warnings from a version of myself who didn't survive. Maybe I'm already gone, and this is the aftershock. Or maybe I'm just next in line. It was supposed to be a standard overnight haul, Nevada desert, long empty roads, and my usual load of electronics bound for Los Angeles, but the kind of trip where your brain goes into autopilot and your biggest worry is running out of coffee before sunrise. I'd done this route so many times, the dotted lines on the road felt like an old lullaby. But this time, something was off. The sky looked wrong. The desert felt heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. At exactly 3:17 a.m., I heard my own voice crackle through the radio, screaming, pleading for help from a place I'd never seen. I froze, heart hammering. That voice, it was me. Same dry rasp, same slight Midwest twang that had stuck with me no matter how long I'd lived out west. Mayday, Mayday, this is Jake Morrison on eastbound I-80, mile marker 247. My truck's been hijacked and I'm trapped in the sleeper compartment. My hands shook as I reached for the mic. This is Jake. I'm not in distress. Repeat, I am not. They've got some kind of chemical cargo that's leaking. I can smell it burning my lungs. I flipped channels. It didn't matter. The voice followed me, every frequency. Same panicked plea, same impossible details. There's a rest stop with a broken neon cactus sign, a water tower with faded motor oil ads, and a mile marker scratched with strange symbols. I hadn't seen anything like that. Not yet, but I could picture it so clearly, like I'd been there before or was destined to go. And then it hit me. He wasn't just describing a place, he was giving directions. By morning, the transmission was gone. Dead air. My mind kept replaying the message, searching for cracks, any excuse to dismiss it as a prank or psychotic break. But deep down, I knew better. I called the depot. Olivia answered. Calm, friendly, too calm. Don't trust the dispatcher. Olivia's been replaced. The real Olivia had a scar on her left hand from a childhood accident. This one doesn't. I remembered that scar. It was small, pale, barely noticeable, but it had been there. The last time I saw her, it wasn't. I stopped at a dusty roadside diner and pulled out my phone. I started searching. Neon cactus signs, rusted water towers, vandalized mile markers. They were real. I had never been to those places, but they existed, scattered across the Southwest like pieces of someone else's memory, his memory. 3 days later, Nevada State Police found an abandoned truck at mile marker 247. The cab matched mine, and even the license plate was close, but the VN didn't exist in any system to spot. Inside the trailer were strange chemical burns on the metal floor and walls, and yet I was still here, still driving. You're not the original, the voice whispered one night. You're a carrier. That's when the dreams started. Nightmares of highways folding in on themselves, of endless static and rows of trucks filled with things that pulsed when no one was looking. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, unable to tell if I was still asleep or still me. The deeper I dug, the more I realized something was very wrong with the trucking network itself. Our routes, our manifests, even our fuel stops, none of it made sense. Patterns began to form, circles, spirals, unnatural loops carved into the logistics of our supply lines. I started tracking others, drivers I'd known for years, guys with tattoos, stories, wives and grandkids, began acting like strangers and blank stares, repeated phrases, no memories of past jobs. At a way station outside Barstow, I ran into Pete, an old friend from way back. We shared war stories of icy roads in Colorado and bar fights in truck stops. He didn't remember any of it.
Pete, I asked carefully, what's your grandson's name again?
He blinked slowly. Cargo's stable, manifest clear. That's when I knew Pete was gone. I pulled my rig over that night and checked my own manifest. Medical supplies seemed normal, but the seal on the trailer was fresh, too fresh. The edges still tacky like it had been placed minutes before. I broke protocol and opened the trailer. Inside were 3 metal containers, each the size of a coffin. No markings, no serial numbers, and they pulsed faintly with light.
I didn't touch them. I couldn't.
Instead, I locked it back up and drove straight to the depot. But no one was there. The gates were open. The lights flickered overhead like a dying heartbeat. Inside, the office was empty. Olivia's desk still had her coffee cup, steam rising, but she was gone. In the corner, the radio hissed. Static. Then my voice again. Jake, if you're hearing this, then they've gotten to you, too. The cargo you're carrying isn't medical supplies. It's eggs. Thousands of them.
I didn't deliver the cargo. Couldn't.
Instead, I drove aimlessly, sleep-deprived and spiraling, until I saw the lights of a warehouse outside Las Vegas. It wasn't on my route. In fact, I'd never seen it before, despite having passed this area dozens of times. It pulsed on the edge of the desert like a wound refusing to heal. Something told me this was where I was meant to go. There were no signs, no logos, just chain-link fences and security cameras. I expected armed guards, barking dogs, flashing lights. Instead, the gate creaked open on its own, slowly, deliberately, inviting me in. The loading dock was alive with figures, pale workers, moving without urgency or emotion. Their eyes glinted like black marbles under the floodlights. None of them spoke. None of them smiled. When I stepped down from my rig, one of them held out a clipboard. The manifest said, biological medical cargo, time sensitive. The signature box already had my name printed.
I didn't sign.
Who sent this? I asked. Where's Olivia? The worker stared through me. I turned to leave when a second one moved between me and the cab. He reached out and grabbed my wrist.
It wasn't a hand, not really, but it was something trying to be one.
Cold, boneless, strong. You don't need to know what's inside, he rasped. Just drive to the destination and don't stop for anything. Don't open the cargo hold. Don't listen to the radio. And whatever you do, don't look in your mirrors after midnight. My voice caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused. My hand moved against my will, scrawling a signature I didn't intend to write. They loaded 3 more containers onto my trailer. The moment the last one clicked into place, the pulse in my ears returned, like pressure building inside my skull. I didn't remember getting back into the cab. One moment I was on the dock, the next I was already halfway down the access road. Headlights sweeping across dry brush and asphalt. That night, the transmission came again. Jake, listen to me. The eggs are almost ready. You need to drive them to the pit, the one near Copper Ridge, old mining site. There's acid runoff there, but it'll kill them if you act now. But if you wait, they'll hatch.
I knew the place.
Everyone in Nevada did. An abandoned copper mine with runoff so toxic it glowed at night. They'd fenced it off years ago, said it was too unstable, but that didn't matter now. The coordinates from the voice lined up perfectly with Copper Ridge. The drive there was the longest of my life. The cargo pulsed harder the closer I got. At first it was subtle, like the trailer's suspension reacting to road bumps, but soon the movement became rhythmic, alive, breathing. I glanced in the rearview mirror, not at the road, at the trailer. For a split second, I saw shadows moving inside it, shapes too big to fit in those containers. My stomach churned, my eyes watered. I couldn't tell if it was fear, fumes, or something deeper, some primal part of me screaming to abandon the mission and disappear. But I didn't stop. When I reached the mine, the gates were unlocked. The pit was just as I remembered from childhood nightmares, a glowing lake of green sludge surrounded by jagged rock and rusting equipment. I backed the trailer to the edge, praying the brakes would hold. Then I stepped out. The containers inside the trailer were bulging now, metal groaning, lights flickering. The heartbeat I'd felt earlier had become a pounding throb. I unlatched the couplings one by one, sweat pouring down my back. Just as I reached the last one, the containers burst open. What spilled out wasn't of this world. Translucent, pulsing organisms with rows of shifting teeth and limbs that moved like liquid fear. They didn't scream, they vibrated, so fast and so violently the air itself seemed to hum.
They didn't attack me, not immediately.
They scanned.
Then one of them turned, and I knew it saw me.
I ran, dove into the cab, slapped the gear into reverse. The trailer teetered on the edge, then dropped. The creatures followed. When the trailer hit the pit, there was no explosion, just a horrible churning, like the earth itself was trying to swallow the horror I'd unleashed. The chemical lake boiled. The things writhed, shriveled, dissolved, or so I thought. Because even as the pit hissed and smoked, the radio came alive one last time.
You did well, Jake, but that was just the first shipment.
I should have disappeared after Copper Ridge. I should have dumped the rig, ditched my ID, and vanished. But the voice came back, sharper now, not desperate like before, instructive, precise. Jake, now that you've proven yourself, we can use you. There are others out there, other shipments, other Jakes. At first, I didn't believe it. Copies, alternate versions of me moving along mirrored highways, repeating the same nightmare on loop. But as the nights went on to burn, the transmissions became clearer and coordinated. They didn't just describe things, they predicted them. There will be a white tanker on I-10. The driver's not one of us anymore. You need to intercept him before he reaches the border. And there was same plate, same driver's face I remembered from a truck stop in Kansas 2 years ago. But when I flagged him down, he didn't blink. Just smiled, too wide, and whispered in a voice I couldn't place. Delivery must continue. I ran him off the road. The tanker rolled into a ditch, cracked open like an egg. Inside wasn't fuel, it was thick, black fluid crawling with veins of bioluminescent threads. It squirmed when it touched the air. I burned it. I sat there for hours watching it boil, with my own reflection rippling in the heat. That was the moment I accepted the truth. This isn't just a localized phenomenon, it's a distribution network. Whatever they are, they've embedded themselves into logistics, disguised as dispatchers, as clients, as drivers. They've weaponized routine. The highways of America have become arteries of something ancient and intelligent.
And we're the blood cells, unknowingly moving it along. I don't sleep anymore.
The voice never stops now. And I've started recognizing details in the transmissions that feel too intimate. Memories I never made, roads I've never driven, but somehow recall with perfect clarity. You're not Jake Morrison, the voice told me one night. You were created to replace him. You're a memory given form, assigned a truck, and fed coordinates. I laughed at first. A bitter, hollow thing. But deep down, I knew the real Jake, the one who first sent those transmissions, he's still out there, trapped, broadcasting across dimensions, a man caught between frequencies, screaming through a veil we weren't meant to hear through. And me? I'm his shadow. Help me shut it down, he begged in the last clear message I received. There's a central hive, a depot near Roswell. That's where they store the cores. The Cedars, burn it, end me. I wrote the coordinates down, 33394265, 104.523203.
Then I burned them into my arm with a lighter, because I knew I wouldn't be allowed to remember otherwise.
Now I'm headed south, toward New Mexico. My cargo is empty. My tank is full. And for the first time in months, the radio is silent. But I know that won't last, because just before the transmission cut off, I heard one final whisper beneath the static. They know you're coming. The approach to Roswell felt different, not like I was headed towards something, but like something was moving toward me. The desert stretched wide and flat, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed, not by people, but by systems. Drones buzzed high overhead. Or maybe they didn't. I stopped trusting my senses about 500 miles back. The closer I got to the coordinates, the more the landscape changed. Road signs were in gibberish, mile markers twisted at wrong angles, the paint on the asphalt shifted when I looked too long. Reality was fraying at the edges.
Then I saw it.
The hive, a massive industrial compound buried in the earth. Only the towers jutted up, like ribs from a buried corpse. Lights moved in choreographed loops. Trucks came and went, all unmarked, their drivers silent, eyes black and blank.
There were hundreds of them.
I parked a mile out and approached on foot, and my boots crunched on soil that pulsed underfoot. Like it was alive, like I was walking on a lung. I found a loading dock near the south entrance, watched two workers unload a rig. When one turned, I saw that his face was smooth, no mouth, just the impression of where a mouth should have been.
I slipped inside.
The interior was colder than the desert outside, unnaturally so. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, but they didn't flicker. Nothing flickered here. Everything was too perfect, too sterile. Room after room lined with cylindrical tanks. Inside, I saw things floating, not quite embryos, not quite machines, somewhere in between. And there, near the back, was the console. A massive control panel bristling with wires, glowing with a dim blue light. I didn't know what I was doing, but my hands did. They moved without me. I entered a sequence, one I didn't recognize, though one I'd never seen, but which felt right. The tanks hissed. Alarms didn't sound. No one came running. The creatures inside just twitched, then convulsed. The blue lights turned red. The machines groaned. And then I heard him again.
Jake, you're inside. I feel it. I feel you.
The voice was no longer just on the radio. It echoed around the room, vibrating through the metal walls.
You're close. My body's still here, though. You're keeping it alive, really. You have to finish it.
I ran deeper into the hive. The core chamber was buried beneath 30 flights of metal stairs. With each step, the temperature dropped. Condensation dripped from steel pipes. The air smelled like ammonia and something far older. At the center of the chamber, suspended in a tank, was a man, or what used to be one. His face was mine. Beard longer, eyes bloodshot, scars along his jawline, tubes threaded through his chest. His lips moved, but no sound came. "The real Jake," I whispered. He nodded. "Barely." I found the terminal beside the tank. Monitors blinked with incomprehensible language too, symbols that made my head ache just by looking at them. But my fingers danced across the keyboard. He was broadcasting, constantly, his brain hooked to the frequency network. The static I'd heard for months, it was his scream. A scream that crossed realities. To shut it down would be to kill him.
Do it, the voice said. My voice, his voice, ours.
I looked at him one last time, eating arm. He gave the smallest nod, eyes full of gratitude and relief. I pressed the final key. The tank lit up, the fluid inside boiled, the tubes spasmed, and then silence! Real silence. For the first time in months, the air wasn't buzzing, my head wasn't vibrating, the static was gone.
Jake Morrison was dead.
and I was still here. I torched the hive on my way out. Don't ask me how. Something in that place wanted to burn. The walls melted like wax. The screams, if you could call them that, came not from mouths but from the infrastructure itself. I watched it collapse in my rearview mirror. That was 3 weeks ago.
I'm still driving, still breathing, though, but something changed in me that night. I'm not Jake Morrison, I never was. I'm the memory of a man who died alone in a glass coffin, screaming through the void. But maybe I'm more than that now.
Because the radio's quiet, the cargo's empty, and for the first time in a long time, I'm choosing where I go. Still, I drive the back roads, the unlisted highways. I pass rigs that don't belong on this earth, piloted by things trying to remember what it means to be human. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear someone calling out, not in distress, but in warning. If you're hearing this, it's already too late. Story number 2. They told me to trust my gut on the road. I learned the hard way that instincts aren't just useful, they might be the only thing keeping you alive in the dark places that maps forgot. I once parked for the night at a rest area hidden deep in the Appalachian Hills, a place whispered about by old-timers on the CB. They called it Mountain View, but I didn't see anything beautiful there. It was just shadows that moved wrong and silence that pressed into your chest. What haunts me most isn't what happened, but how ordinary the beginning felt. A quiet night, a truck stop off the main drag, a man who stood too still. That's all it took to tip my world sideways. Some places are cursed, not because of what they are, but because of what hunts there. I stopped to help someone once. Just one stranger. And for the rest of my life, I wished I hadn't.
I should have kept driving.
The sun had already disappeared behind the rolling hills of Tennessee when James pulled his 18-wheeler into the gravel lot of the Mountain View rest area after 14 hours of driving through winding mountain roads. His body ached and his eyes burned from the strain of navigating the treacherous curves that snaked through the Appalachian foothills. The rest area was one of those forgotten places that seemed frozen in time, with weathered picnic tables, rusted trash cans, and a single flickering streetlight that cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt. I remember feeling the air thin out when I stepped down from the cab, like even the wind didn't want to touch that place. There was a stillness to it, not peaceful, not calm, but watching. I've parked at 1,000 truck stops in my day, and most of them have some kind of rhythm, idling engines, CB chatter, dogs barking from sleeper cabs. Not this one. James had been hauling freight for nearly 2 decades, and he prided himself on knowing every truck stop, rest area, and safe haven between Atlanta and Pittsburgh. This particular stop wasn't on any official maps or trucking guides, but veteran drivers whispered about it in CB radio conversations. A place where you could park for the night without being hassled by state troopers or lot lizards looking to make a quick buck. I always thought I had seen it all. Dead animals on the road, people sleeping under tarps, kids trying to flag you down with bloody hands, but nothing prepared me for what I met at Mountain View, because what I saw didn't fit. It didn't move like a person, didn't feel like one either. It was isolated enough to guarantee peace and quiet, nestled between 2 steep ridges that blocked out most of the noise from the interstate below. The October air carried the crisp bite of autumn, and James could smell wood smoke drifting down from the scattered cabins that dotted the mountainside. He'd always found something comforting about these remote Appalachian communities, where people still lived by the old ways and minded their own business. That comfort turned to unease when I spotted the truck. As James performed his routine post-drive inspection, checking tire pressure and securing his load of construction materials bound for a job site in West Virginia, he noticed another vehicle in the lot. A beat-up pickup truck sat at the far end of the rest area, its rusted body barely visible in the dim light. The truck looked like it had been there for hours, maybe even days, with leaves scattered across its windshield and what appeared to be a thick layer of dust coating its faded blue paint. It was the kind of vehicle you expected to see in the background of a horror movie, forgotten, tilted, and wrong. One of its doors hung open just enough to hint that someone had either left in a hurry or been pulled out. I'd seen scenes like that before, and they never ended well. Something about the abandoned vehicle made James uneasy. Though he couldn't quite put his finger on why, perhaps it was the way it sat at an odd angle, as if it had been parked hastily, or the fact that one of its doors hung slightly ajar. He'd learned to trust his instincts over the years, and right now they were telling him that something wasn't right about this place. Still, there's an unwritten rule in trucking: if someone might be in trouble, you check. Doesn't matter how it feels, you check. James decided to investigate, thinking that perhaps someone needed help. Breakdowns were common in these mountain areas where cell phone service was spotty and the nearest tow truck might be hours away. He'd helped stranded motorists countless times over the years, and it was an unwritten code among truckers to lend assistance when possible. That's when I saw him standing at the edge of the parking lot, barely visible in the dim light cast by the flickering street lamp, was a figure that seemed to have materialized from the darkness itself. The man was tall and gaunt, wearing what appeared to be dirty coveralls that hung loosely on his skeletal frame. His hair was long and unkempt, hanging in greasy strands around a face that James couldn't quite make out in the shadows. He didn't blink, didn't twitch. He stood like a statue, but wrong, leaning too still, too straight. Like something that had memorized how to be human, but didn't quite get it right. But what caught James's attention immediately was what the man held in his right hand, a large pipe wrench, easily 2 feet long, that gleamed dully in the pale light. The tool looked heavy and well used, with dark stains along its metal surface that James didn't want to think about too closely.
I spoke, trying to make it feel normal, asked if he needed help. He didn't answer.
The man wasn't moving, just standing there like a scarecrow, but his eyes, even from this distance, James could feel them boring into him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. There was something fundamentally wrong about the way the figure stood, too still, too patient, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike.
When he did move, it was like a switch flipped.
He didn't stumble or run, he lunged, like he'd been waiting for me all along. He came at me with that wrench like it was forged for killing. I didn't stop to think. I turned and ran like my boots were on fire. And in that moment, I realized something terrible. He was fast. Faster than someone like him should have been. I could hear the crunch of gravel behind me, so not stomping, not clumsy, but precise, like a hunter pacing his stride with mine. I didn't dare look back. The cab of my truck was maybe 50 feet away, but every step felt like I was running through syrup. The worst part, I knew what that wrench could do to a skull. I'd used one myself in a different life. Back in the army, one good swing and you're not waking up. Could feel him behind me, feel the space closing between us. When my hand hit the door handle, I yanked it so hard I nearly tore it off. I flung myself into the seat and slammed the door just as something heavy smacked the side of the cab. The entire truck shook. I looked out the window, and there he was, still standing, still staring. The wrench had left a deep dent in the door. I locked the cab and started the engine with hands that didn't want to cooperate. He moved again, circling the truck like he was measuring me, testing the walls. His eyes never left mine. James tried to start the engine, but his hands were shaking so badly that he kept missing the ignition switch. The sound of metal on metal was deafening, and James was certain that the man would eventually break through one of the windows and drag him out into the darkness. When the truck finally roared to life, it felt like waking from a nightmare. I hit the gas and didn't look back until I did. As the truck lurched forward, he saw the man in his rearview mirror, still standing in the parking lot and watching him leave. And even as the distance increased, James could see that terrible figure silhouetted against the streetlight, motionless once again, but somehow even more menacing in his stillness. I drove 50 miles without blinking. My mind raced faster than the engine. Every dark shape on the side of the highway looked like him. Every overpass felt like an ambush. When I finally reached a truck stop, lit like a football stadium. I pulled in and called the state police.
They took my statement seriously. No chuckling, no condescension. Maybe they'd heard something before, but maybe I wasn't the first.
Sir, can you describe the individual who attacked you? The dispatcher asked. James tried to put into words what he had seen. But how do you describe someone who seemed more like a force of nature than a human being? I gave them everything I could. The coveralls, the hair, the wrench. But it was his eyes that kept sticking in my brain like splinters. Empty eyes, like staring down a well that didn't echo it. The dispatcher assured James that they would investigate thoroughly and advised him to seek medical attention if he felt he needed it. But James knew that no doctor could treat what was really wrong with him. 3 hours later, the phone rang again. They'd found the pickup, found blood, found evidence of a struggle. The truck was registered to Harold Wickham, missing 3 weeks. The officer's voice shifted when he said it. We're treating this as foul play. Something about the scene made their skin crawl too. But I told them to check the woods, told them that truck wasn't a vehicle, it was a lure. Officer, you need to check the woods around that rest area. James said urgently, I have a feeling you're going to find more than just one missing person. They did. Over the next month, search teams found 7 shallow graves in the forest around Mountain View, all different people. All travelers, all gone without a trace, until now.
They never caught him.
The killer was never found, despite an extensive manhunt that involved multiple law enforcement agencies and search teams with tracking dogs. He just vanished, like smoke. James never drove through Tennessee again without thinking about that night and the man with a wrench. He'd come within seconds of becoming another statistic. Another missing person whose fate would remain a mystery to his family and friends. I stopped taking back roads, started sleeping in lit areas, kept a crowbar under the seat. I told myself it was paranoia, but it wasn't. It was survival. The incident changed him in ways that were hard to articulate. He became more cautious, more aware of his surroundings, and less trusting of isolated places that had once seemed peaceful and safe.
Sometimes I still see him.
Not really. But I'll be driving through the night, see a shape in the ditch, and my blood goes cold, and I have to tell myself, it's just your imagination. But what if it's not? What if he's still out there? The Mountain View rest area was eventually closed by the state, and the access road was barricaded. But James knew that wouldn't stop someone like the man with the wrench. Predators like that simply moved on to new hunting grounds. New places where they could wait in the shadows for their next victim. And somewhere out there, in another forgotten rest area or abandoned truck stop, James was certain that the man was still waiting, still holding that blood-stained wrench, still searching for the next traveler who would make the mistake of offering help to a stranger in the darkness.
It wasn't the violence that haunted me, it was the randomness.
I was this close to dying. If I'd parked in a different space, if I'd opened that truck door 5 seconds slower, if I'd been tired enough to hesitate.
That's what eats at me.
Because in the end, the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones in horror movies or urban legends. They're the ones that look like ordinary people until the moment they reveal their true nature. And by then, it's usually too late to run. Story number 3. There's a reason I don't stop at unlit truck plazas anymore. Not since Bakersfield. Not since Moonlight. I'd been on the road long enough to know when something felt wrong, not highway patrol ticket kind of wrong, but the kind that presses against your spine and whispers things your conscious mind refuses to hear. That night. It wasn't the loneliness, the engine hum, or the fog closing in like a velvet curtain. It was the feeling that I wasn't the only thing moving through the night. I parked my rig like I always do, engine down, locks checked, pistol within arm's reach. That part of the job never changes. What did change was the pattern on the side of my trailer, some kind of oily residue, geometric and alive looking, that shimmered beneath the overhead lights like a mirage. I didn't touch it. Didn't want to. Then I saw them. 2 figures at the edge of the lot, caught between shadow and flickering light. They weren't talking, just standing there, moving like puppets with an invisible hand pulling the same string, and the air around them felt denser, like reality got heavier wherever they stood. People think the worst thing on the road is sleep deprivation or falling asleep behind the wheel. Promise you, it's not. It's being fully awake at a truck stop and realizing something's watching you that shouldn't exist. I've been driving big rigs for over a decade, army trained, civilian toughened, and stubborn enough to haul freight through storms, deserts, and ice-coated passes. But what happened that night at Moonlight Truck Plaza rewired something in me. The fog rolled in thick that November night as Danny pulled his rig into the Moonlight Truck Plaza just outside of Bakersfield, California. He'd been driving for 16 straight hours, hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Phoenix to Sacramento, and his eyelids felt like sandpaper against his eyes. The diner served coffee that could raise the dead. But I wasn't there for the coffee. I needed 10 hours of shut-eye to stay legal. Truckers know danger in many forms: mechanical failure, tired hands, bad weather, sketchy towns. But some threats have no place in the CDL handbook. I parked near the back, out of habit, the kind of spot that lets you leave quick if something goes sideways. Not that I expected anything. Did my walk around, checking tires, cables, and trailer seals like always, but I kept catching movement in my periphery. Danny noticed two figures standing near the edge of the parking lot, partially hidden in the shadows, cast by a broken streetlight. At first glance, they appeared to be having a conversation, but something about their body language struck him as odd.
They didn't belong there, so you know that instinct that tells you a person's dangerous before they say a word? These two radiated it. Now, one was an older guy.
Mechanic jumpsuit caked in grease, his eyes shining like polished chrome. The other, well, I thought she was wearing a long coat until the light shifted. That wasn't clothing, it was her skin, draped loose like wet paper. I turned away, forced myself to focus on the rig, but every time I looked back, they were a little closer, always still, always watching, not walking, gliding. That's when I noticed the symbols on my trailer. Someone had been rubbing something on the side of his trailer. The substance looked like grease or oil, but it had an iridescent quality that seemed to shift and shimmer in the artificial light. The marks formed a pattern that hurt Di's eyes to look at directly. My first thought was sabotage. My second was something worse. I shouted at them, expecting them to run, but the man just grinned. Teeth like piano keys, too many, too perfect. "Hey!" Danny hollered at the two figures, his voice echoing across the parking lot. "What the hell are you doing to my truck?" The man in the jumpsuit looked up and smiled, revealing teeth that were far too white and far too sharp for any human mouth. He came toward me like he had all the time in the world. His companion followed, her joints bending at angles that hurt my own limbs to watch. I backed toward the cab, hand on the pistol stashed in the door panel. Army taught me never to hesitate. Civilian life taught me never to fire unless there's no other option. That night blurred the lines between both. They spoke in unison, as if they were one voice split in two bodies. "Your cargo isn't what you think. We're trying to protect you from what's inside." Danny climbed into his cab and locked the door, but he could see both figures approaching in his mirrors. The woman was now standing on his step, pressing her face against the window. Her breath fogged the glass as she smiled, revealing gums that were black with decay and teeth that looked like they'd been filed to points.
I wanted to believe this was a nightmare. Sleep deprivation being hallucination, missing maybe bad diner food. But then she started chanting, mouth moving but no sound reaching me. Her eyes turned pure black, like they weren't eyes at all, but tunnels.
The man produced a crowbar. The woman pounded the passenger side. I could see blood. Hers, maybe? Maybe not. They weren't trying to kill me. They were trying to stop something else. Then the trailer moved. It wasn't wind, wasn't my imagination. I felt the sway of something shifting weight inside the trailer. And then Danny began to hear sounds coming from his trailer, scratching, scraping noises like fingernails on metal, accompanied by what sounded like whispered conversations in a language he didn't recognize. I started the engine, barely able to hold the keys. My breath came in sharp bursts. The diesel growled to life, and I gunned it. The man fell off the side rail. The woman thing held on, her face pressed against the window, chanting silently. Her eyes reflected dozens of me, twisted and distorted like funhouse mirrors. Finally, she let go. I watched her tumble into the fog and vanish. But I kept hearing her laughter long after she was gone. I drove through the night without stopping, passing way stations, open diners, and sleepy towns until the lights of Sacramento blinked into view. I didn't breathe easy until the truck pulled into the delivery site. I climbed out, walked to the trailer, unlocked the doors. Empty. The agricultural equipment that had been loaded in Phoenix was gone, leaving only strange burn marks on the trailer floor and the lingering smell of ozone and decay. I checked the paperwork, called dispatch, called the shipper. They either had no idea what I was talking about or pretended they didn't. The warehouse in Phoenix, abandoned, no employees on record. The people who signed my manifest never existed. Insurance flagged it as fraud. But the thing that haunted me most wasn't the missing cargo. It was what followed. 2 weeks later, I'm home, half drunk in front of the TV, when the local news flashes footage from a Central Valley farming town. Whole families missing, houses abandoned, crops dead, burned from the inside out. Witnesses claimed they saw lights moving in the sky and heard voices in the irrigation lines. That's when I knew. Danny knew with absolute certainty that whatever he had been hauling that night was connected to these disappearances. The woman and her companion hadn't been trying to rob him. They'd been trying to stop something far worse from reaching its destination. I hadn't delivered farm equipment. I'd delivered something ancient and wrong into the heart of California's food system, and now it was spreading. Since that night, I've changed. I don't take cash jobs. I inspect every load myself, end to end, no matter how rushed the schedule. I avoid places with no cameras, avoid truck stops with old names and new owners, and I definitely don't stop if I see two people standing too still under broken lights. I've learned there are routes in America best left unmapped, freight best left undelivered, and warnings that come not as signs, but as people twisted into strange shells of themselves, still fighting on our behalf from whatever edge of reality they come from. Sometimes late at night, when he was driving through farming areas, Danny would see lights moving through the fields and hear sounds that reminded him of that terrible night at the Moonlight Truck Plaza. I've heard them too, above almond groves, through corn rows, in fields that ripple without wind. Some nights, I swear I see the translucent woman on the edge of my vision. Sometimes I wake up to symbols traced in grease across my windshield. They're not done with me. He'd learned to avoid certain routes, certain truck stops, and certain shipping companies that paid too well for jobs that seemed too simple, but because he knew now that not all cargo was what it appeared to be, and not all deliveries were meant for human recipients.
Maybe I was a mule for the end of something. Maybe I was just unlucky.
But I can still feel that cargo in the empty space behind me. The highway never sleeps, and neither do the things that ride it in the dark. They say the mind plays tricks under exhaustion, but that if you drive long enough through empty roads and empty towns, you start to imagine ghosts on the shoulder. But what I saw in Fresno wasn't a ghost yet. It was a building that didn't want to be seen. It started with a call from a driver I knew. Manny, Vietnam vet, hauled produce for 30 years. He called me, voice shaking like a coffee cup on a rough dashboard. He said he saw the woman, or the one with the skin like wax paper. She was outside a warehouse near Clovis, just standing, staring, and then she vanished.
I didn't want to believe him, but something in his voice made me take a detour.
The place didn't exist on GPS, just a dirt road off Route 168, hidden behind a line of almond trees where no almond trees should have grown. The road was too narrow for a rig, so I parked my cab and walked the rest. I found the warehouse, big, black sheet metal, no windows, just a loading dock and a side door with rusted numbers etched over it. 731B.
No sign, no lights, no movement. But I heard it.
Something breathing inside. I circled the building. Every time I looked away, I felt it shift. Like the whole structure turned by a few degrees while I wasn't watching, like it was hiding its real face. I approached the door. The metal was cold, colder than the outside air, and it smelled familiar. Ozone, grease, burned earth. Just like my trailer that night, I placed my palm on the door, and every hair on my body stood up. That's when I knew this was where it came from, or where it had returned. Then I saw them. The man in the jumpsuit, the woman with the slack skin. They didn't approach. They stood 30 yards off, between the almond trees, where, watching like sentries and all mourners, I raised a hand, not in threat, but in acknowledgement. And they nodded. That's when I knew they weren't monsters. Not really, they were guardians, gatekeepers, and maybe not human anymore, but trying to keep something worse inside.
I don't remember leaving. 1 minute I was at the door, the next I was back in my cab. Engine running, radio on. The GPS now showed the road behind me, but no trace of the warehouse. I looked in the mirror, expecting to see the woman again. Nothing.
But taped to my dashboard was a single piece of paper. No writing, just a symbol. The same greasy geometric loop I'd seen on my trailer. Only this time it was drawn in blood. Story number 4.
The first time I saw it, I thought it was roadkill, a large, dark mass stretched across both lanes of the highway, unmoving. But as my headlights lit it up, I realized it had fingers.
They say the highway is quiet at night, or peaceful, even. That's a lie. The silence isn't calm, it's suffocating. And if you drive long enough, far enough, past where even the deer refuse to tread, you'll feel it. That pressure, like the trees are watching. Some drivers break from boredom, others from exhaustion. But me? I broke because I made the mistake of stopping. What I saw that night didn't belong on any highway. It wasn't a man. It wore a man like a costume, and it was waiting for someone stupid enough to care. I've driven through storms, ice, and wildlife stampedes, but nothing prepared me for the thing that mimicked death just to get close. The headlights of Rick's Peterbilt cut through the pre-dawn darkness as he navigated the winding 2-lane highway through rural Montana. It wasn't unusual for Rick to drive alone at night, hauling lumber across forgotten roads that snaked through pine-choked valleys, but this stretch, somewhere beyond the last gas station, deep into the forest, always made him feel off, not scared, just observed. He had driven this route for years, knew the curves, the blind turns, even the spot where a moose once totaled a Subaru. But something about this night was different. The moon refused to show itself, the stars hidden behind clouds that didn't seem to move. Rick preferred these lonely highways to the busy interstates. Out here, he didn't have to worry about road rage or city chaos. It was just him and the hum of the diesel. But the silence tonight was wrong, heavy, unnatural. And then he saw them, 3 deer, frozen on the side of the road, not grazing, not startled, just staring. He felt the urge to speed up, but he didn't. Something old inside him, something primal, told him to slow down.
And that's when he saw the body.
There, sprawled across both lanes of the highway, was what appeared to be a human body. It lay face down, arms and legs arranged in a pose that didn't look accidental, ritualistic, even. Rick slowed to a crawl, instincts kicking in. No other vehicles in sight, no tire marks, no blood. The forest around him seemed to hold its breath. He stepped out, flashlight in one hand, pistol in the other. His boots crunched the gravel shoulder. "You okay?" he called. There was no response, no movement, no sign of life. As his beam swept over the figure, Rick noticed the limbs were wrong, too thin, the angles unnatural. It looked freshly dead, but it smelled rotten, not just of decay, but of chemicals, like embalming fluid mixed with wet leaves. He crouched, but that's when he saw it. The jaw wasn't connected, where it had been placed like a prop, and the skin wasn't real. It had seams.
Then a noise behind him, wet and deliberate.
Rick ran back to his cab and climbed inside, locking the doors and grabbing his CB radio. Dead zone. Of course, he shouted anyway, broadcasting on every emergency channel. Nothing. Static. He turned to look at the figure again, only it wasn't on the road anymore. It was standing.
And worse, it was smiling.
The figure was definitely human, but something about the proportions seemed off. Like the torso was too long, the limbs too thin, and the head was positioned at an angle that should have been impossible for a living person. It started walking. No, not walking, twitching forward, one limb at a time, like a puppet on tangled strings. Rick floored the accelerator. His rig groaned in protest, but he didn't care. He had to get away.
In the mirrors, it kept appearing closer. One moment it was far behind, the next, it was nearly beside him. No footsteps, no running, just jumps, like frames missing in reality.
The chase continued for miles, with the creature maintaining its impossible pursuit while Rick pushed his truck to its mechanical limits. Every time he looked, it was closer till, at one point, it had one hand on the trailer till he heard metal bend.
Then lights, a town, a civilization.
The instant his wheels crossed into the lit perimeter of the first building, the thing vanished. No sound, no trace, just gone. He parked outside an all-night diner and sat there, engine idling, trying to breathe. When he finally worked up the courage to call the local sheriff's department, they sent a deputy to take his statement. The cop was polite, but dismissive. "Driver fatigue, he said. "You'd be surprised what people see when they've been on the road too long." Rick didn't argue. What would be the point? The next day, Rick drove back to mile marker 47 with a trooper. Nothing, nobody, no disturbance, just empty road. But Rick couldn't shake it. He started digging. Forums, CB chatter, paranormal threads. Over the following months, Rick began researching similar incidents and found a disturbing pattern. Stories, almost identical. Drivers stopping for bodies that turned out not to be human, and figures that stood up, that followed, that mimicked pain to draw people in. No one believed them either. Rick changed his routes, installed extra lights, started warning others. Most laughed, a few listened, but every so often, someone would message him late at night. "I saw one too," they'd say, "on Highway 95, near Texarkana, northbound I-15, different roads, same horror, and always the same MO, alone, isolated, dark, and a body lying too still, waiting to be seen." Most truckers don't believe in monsters. We believe in traffic reports, axle weight limits, and how many miles we can squeeze out of a full tank. But when I shared my story, something strange happened. Not all of them laughed. All of them. A guy named Torres messaged me first. Said he'd seen something similar in Arizona back in '09. He described a woman lying in the middle of a desert road. She looked broken, bones sticking out where they shouldn't. But when he got within 10 feet, she stood up. Backwards.
Her knees bent the wrong way.
Another driver, Linda, who hauls cattle across the Dakotas, told me about a child she found alone on an icy pass. Crying, shivering, she wrapped him in a blanket, brought him into her cab. Halfway down the mountain, the boy tried to open the door at 70 miles an hour. When she looked at him in the mirror, his eyes were all black. No whites, no irises, just pits. I started collecting these stories, archiving them, mapping them out. And I noticed a pattern. The events weren't random. They moved, slowly, always through isolated highways. Never more than one sighting per route per year, like predators migrating. We called them the mimes, things that mimic us, that pretend to be helpless, that learn from each attempt. But we weren't the only ones learning. 2 weeks after the incident at mile marker 47, I picked up a load out of Boise. Short trip, only 4 hours. Took the long route, the safe one. Wide open roads, gas stations, every 50 miles. But just past the halfway point, my GPS rerouted me, said there was a landslide ahead. Told me to cut across a back road called Quarry Spur. I shouldn't have listened, but I did. And once I turned down that road, my signal died. Just like before, my CB2, total silence, just me and the cargo. That's when I heard something shift in the trailer, a soft drag, like burlap across steel. I locked the brakes and jumped out, gun in hand, opened the rear hatch.
Empty.
Cargo still strapped, no sign of movement, but the air was wrong, still, heavy. It smelled like an open grave, and something had scratched 4 vertical lines into the inside wall, like tally marks.
When I shut the hatch and turned around, I wasn't alone.
At first, I thought it was another driver. He wore a uniform, brown coveralls, reflective tape across the chest, name tag, read Jim. But there was no truck, and he wasn't breathing. He just stood there, smiling.
Hey, buddy, you lost? I asked. Well,
his head tilted, not curiously, mechanically, like a mannequin pushed too far. Then he raised one hand and pointed behind me. I turned, instinct, not logic, and when I looked back, Jim was gone.
The only sound was my engine still running, but I couldn't move, like my legs had locked. My heart thudded in my throat.
Something was behind me, too. I knew it, and I could feel the heat of its stare, but I didn't turn. I climbed back into my cab, locked the doors, and peeled off. In the mirror, I caught one last glimpse. Jim was standing in the middle of the road, right where I'd been.
But now he had my face.
I stopped sleeping in motels after that. I'd park under floodlights, leave the engine running, one eye open. At a Love's Outside Amarillo, a guy knocked on my window and said his name was Dale, claimed he used to work for the Department of Transportation. Black side, he looked normal, too normal, clean-shaven, wrinkle-free shirt, not a speck of road dust, and which was weird, considering it was 2 a.m. and his car wasn't anywhere in the lot. He said, "You saw one, didn't you?"
I didn't answer. I didn't have to.
He told me the government had files on these things, with some even redacted reports, and frozen bodies in containment, but nothing they did ever worked. "They don't come from here, he whispered, "but they understand us, better than we understand ourselves." Then he handed me a USB stick, said it had dashcam footage from a border checkpoint where a mime had tried to get through, wearing the skin of a missing Marine.
"They're learning speech," he added. "They're getting better." Then he left.
The USB fried my laptop the moment I plugged it in. I tried quitting.
I really did.
Sold my rig, moved to South Carolina, started fixing lawnmowers for a living. Quiet life, ordinary. But it didn't last. One night, I came home to find my porch light flickering. No big deal. I stepped outside to tighten the bulb, and across the street. Standing beneath the amber glow of a street lamp was a figure. Not moving, not blinking, wearing a reflective vest, holding a clipboard. Even from 50 feet away, I could tell it was wearing someone else's skin.
I moved back inside and locked the doors and watched it all night. It didn't move. Not once.
But by morning, it was gone. That's when I realized this wasn't about highways anymore.
They had followed me home.
Now I'm back on the road, not for work, for war. I drive with floodlights on all sides, 2 satellite phones, a pistol in the dash, and a shotgun behind the seat. I only stop at stations with cameras. I talk to no one. And still, I see them, not every night, but often enough to know they're still watching, waiting, adapting. I'm not special, I just survived. The road was full of dangers that no driving manual could prepare you for, and the most terrifying ones were the ones that looked like they needed help. And that's why I'm telling you this. Next time you see a body in the road, a kid crying on the shoulder, or a man waving for help in the rain, keep driving. If they really need help, someone else will come.
But if they look too still,
Too perfect? If your gut says something's off,
believe it.
Story number 5. There's a place in America where headlights never touch the ground right, where machines don't echo, and the road breathes back at you. Most truckers fear the ice, the wind, or the empty. But me? I fear the ones that don't belong in the fleet, the ones that only look like trucks. It wasn't the cold that almost killed me out there. It was what answered a woman's scream on the CB. Some things hunt across highways, using the skins of steel and diesel. I met one, barely escaped. She didn't. If you ever see a blue Peterbilt with flames on the side and eyes where the windshield should be, don't stop, don't look, just drive. The road doesn't lie, but it doesn't always tell you the whole truth either. Today, I've been a long-haul trucker for over 2 decades, and in that time, I've seen blizzards swallow caravans whole, jackknives that ended careers, and folks who disappeared like smoke, but nothing prepared me for what happened in Wyoming. That night carved something into me I'll never scrub clean. The Wyoming wind howled across the empty plains as I guided my Kenworth through the darkness, hauling a load of industrial machinery across the country. It was nearly 2 a.m. on a moonless Thursday night in February, and the temperature had dropped to 15 below zero. The cold was the kind that crept into your bones and made you question your next breath. The kind of cold that made the metal of your rig contract and groan like a living thing in pain. I was used to driving solo. It gave me time to think. Or, more often, not think. There's something sacred in the rhythm of tires humming on pavement. I had the cab stocked, spare diesel, a satellite phone, rations, and weapons. You don't do cross-country without insurance, and mine came in both lead and diesel. The Wyoming stretch of Interstate 80 was notorious for sudden blizzards that could turn a routine drive into a life-or-death survival situation. But that night, no snow. Just a vast, star-punched sky, and a silence so loud it pressed against your ears. It felt wrong. Like the sky was watching. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of my headlights. A ribbon of asphalt cutting through a landscape so desolate it might as well have been the surface of another planet. I was about 40 miles east of Laramie when the CB crackled. Not static, something human. A voice, female, scared out of her mind. "Please, somebody help me. I'm trapped in a truck at mile marker 235. He's coming back, and I don't think I can hide much longer. If anyone can hear this, please call the police. Please." I grabbed my mic fast. "This is eastbound on I-80. I copy your transmission. What's your location and what kind of help do you need?" Silence. Then, I don't know exactly where I am. I was hitchhiking and this trucker picked me up. But something's wrong with him. He's not normal. I managed to lock myself in the sleeper compartment, but he knows I'm in here. I checked GPS. Marker 235 was 15 miles ahead. My gut turned. Every instinct screamed to hit the brakes. Turn around. Mind my business. Instead, I floored it.
"What's your name, miss?" I asked. "I'm Michael, and I'm heading your way right now. Can you describe the truck you're in?"
"My name is Sarah," she replied, barely audible. "It's a blue Peterbilt with flames painted on the sides. The driver said his name was Carl, but when I looked at his logbook, had a different name. And his eyes, God, his eyes were completely black. Black, no whites, no pupils, not human, not sick or high, something else. I tried my satellite phone, no signal. Impossible. I was under open sky and tried again. Nothing. CB. I called out for help to any truckers nearby. Dead air. I was alone out there, except for her, and whatever was with her. He's back. He's trying to get into the sleeper. Oh God, he's not using the door handle. He's doing something to the metal. It's bending like it's made of clay. My stomach clenched. In the background, I heard something. Not banging, not tools. Something wet and grinding, like metal being chewed. "Sarah, can you see anything? Is there a weapon in the sleeper you can use?" "There's a crowbar under the bunk. but I don't think it would help. Michael, this thing isn't human. Why, I can see its shadow through the curtain. It's too tall, too thin, and the smell, it smells like burning copper and rotting meat.
I crested a hill and saw lights.
Hazards, blinking on the shoulder. A blue Peterbilt, flames on the side. Everything she said, there it was. But it wasn't right. The metal rippled like water. The flames on the side, they weren't paint. They were flickering, dancing. The trailer rocked side to side with no wind, as if something inside was moving or breathing. I stopped 100 yards back, fishy, grabbed my shotgun. It gathered dust for years. Now it felt heavier than ever.
Sarah, I'm here. I can see the truck. I'm coming to get you out. No! Her scream pierced through static. Don't come closer. It's not just the driver. The whole truck is wrong. Or it's alive somehow, and it's hungry.
I froze and watched. The cab began to stretch. Chrome pipes twisted like tentacles. The windshield rippled and blinked. It wasn't glass. It was a cluster of black, reflective eyes. The grille split, revealing rows of metallic teeth. Not a machine. Not anymore.
Sarah, where are you in that thing?
Still in the sleeper, but it's changing. The walls are getting soft. Michael, I don't think this is a truck. I think it's something that looks like a truck. To trick people into coming close. It moved, not on tires, flowing, like a slug made of wires and chrome. I reversed, fast, but it was faster. Tentacles lashed around my bumper, pulling. My truck groaned under the strain. I slammed the accelerator, wheels screeching.
Michael, help me. It's dissolving the walls. I can see outside, but everything looks wrong. Like I'm inside a stomach, like... Snap. The tendrils tore loose. I broke free. I drove for 20 miles before the radio came back.
I called 911, told them everything. They sent a patrol to marker 235. They found nothing. No truck, no Sarah, no signs of life, just asphalt and stars. They chalked it up to fatigue, isolation, hallucination. But I know, Sarah was real. Her voice still echoes sometimes. Late at night, when I pass a certain bend in Utah, or that rest stop in Montana, where radios always cut out. I did research, found missing persons reports, all hitchhikers, all near trucking corridors, no bodies, just vanishings. And sometimes, someone reports seeing a strange truck, and the blue Peterbilt, the flames, eyes in the windshield. The highways are feeding grounds. Well, that thing's still out there, still driving, still hunting. It waits, mimics, perfects. Even uses CB chatter now, mimics human voices, maybe even Sarah's. And after that night, I didn't return to trucking for 3 months. Parked the Kenworth in a friend's garage and stared at maps instead. Routes, incidents, reports. I filed a report with the Highway Patrol, DHS, even MUFON. I wasn't looking for believers. I needed patterns.
And I found them.
He began researching similar incidents and found a disturbing pattern of missing hitchhikers and unexplained disappearances along major trucking routes. You don't see them in the headlines. Most victims don't have families. No one reports them missing. Hitchhikers, drifters, women no one looks for. They vanish without a trace. No wreckage, no calls, just silence. The creature was still out there, still hunting, still perfecting its disguise, and it wasn't just the truck, it was the performance. CB banter, logbooks, stickers, brake lights, mimicked every piece of the long-haul routine. And then it waited. It understood its prey. So I changed. I started carrying more than a shotgun. Wired EMP bursts under the cab, loaded my CB with frequency scanners, installed my own analog jammers. I called it paranoia, but every week on the road, I felt its echo again, far off, like sonar pinging beneath the asphalt. I tried to warn others. A few laughed, a few believed, most just nodded politely and kept rolling. We're trained not to look too close out there when some of us can't afford to.
But that didn't stop me.
One night, somewhere outside of Barstow, I caught something, a faint signal on a private trucker band.
Can anyone hear me? I'm inside. Again. It's changing. Please. Help me. Sarah?
I slammed the brakes, rewound the loop. Nothing. No reply. But the voice it wasn't a recording. It was new. Alive. I followed the signal for hours. Desert heat rising, highway stretching empty under moonlight, but I never found her. Just miles of nothing and an echo in the static. Then one night, years later, I found the Peterbilt again. Outside of Salt Lake, same paint, same decals, same eyes in the windshields.
But this time, it didn't try to hide. It wanted me to see.
It blinked once, slowly. Then it pulled away from the rest stop and melted into the shadows between overpasses, like it was daring me to follow.
I didn't.
But I still hear it. CBs crackling in the dead zones, Sarah's voice, caught in a loop, the smell of burning copper in way station parking lots. Sometimes I wonder if it's still the same creature, or if there are more now, more trucks that aren't trucks. Last month, a rookie driver posted a blurry photo online, captioned, "Saw this beast on I-20, blue Peterbilt, flames, no license plates. It passed me going 100 easy, my CB fried a minute later." The comments were mostly jokes, except for one, no name, no profile pic, just,
"They're not hunting anymore. They're collecting."
I saved that photo. It's grainy, distorted, but if you zoom in on the windshield, real close, you'll see her.
A face, mouth open, frozen in terror, eyes pressed to the glass like she's trying to scream through it.
And behind her, black shapes, moving, waiting.
You want to know what scares me most?
Not the creature, not even the voice. What scares me most is that someday I might answer that call again, and this time I'll see Sarah. Not trapped, not screaming.
Driving.
Story number 6. The smell of scorched rubber and old diesel clung to the air like a warning left behind by the road itself. I'd pulled into my fair share of forgotten truck stops in 15 years behind the wheel. Some had character, others had ghosts. But this one, Murphy's last stop, it felt like both had co-signed the lease, and it was a nowhere place in the middle of Nevada, a desert town so swallowed by dust that even God had probably crossed it off the map. The neon sign above the station fizzled as if protesting its own existence, casting half-lit spells across the cracked asphalt. This wasn't just a pit stop, it was a threshold. I was 11 hours deep into a cross-state haul. Electronics this time, Los Angeles to Salt Lake. The hum of the engine had faded into the background of my brain, but the moment I pulled into Murphy's lot, I felt something cut through the fatigue, a pressure behind the eyes, like something watching from a place where eyes shouldn't exist.
And then I saw him,
The truck rolled in like a panther, silent, glossy, out of place, a shiny Peterbilt with fresh California plates. The driver stepped out stiffly, as if his joints didn't quite trust gravity. He moved toward the diner doors, his silhouette folding oddly in the fluorescent light, like a VHS tape stuck between frames. I watched him go inside. I should have kept driving, but I didn't, because men like me don't fear shadows. We fear falling asleep at 70 miles an hour. So I got out, locked the rig, and walked into the belly of Murphy's last stop. Inside, the place was exactly what I expected. Wood-paneled walls lined with yellowed ads, a flickering jukebox I'd bet my last dollar still played Patsy Cline. A woman behind the counter, her face carved by years of night shifts, and that other driver, already at the coffee station, filling his cup with liquid that looked blacker than crude oil. "Long night?" I asked. He turned and smiled. His eyes were too bright, his teeth too sharp. "Every night's a long night," he said, his voice like metal dragged across bone. "But I enjoy the darkness. Lets me focus on my work." Something in the way he said work made my spine stiffen. Like it meant something far removed from cargo and manifests. He extended a hand, long fingers, pale and cold, nails curved, but not bitten, grown that way. "Name's Carl Wickham. I've been on these roads longer than I care to admit.
I shook his hand, immediately regretted it. It felt rough, scaly, like sandpaper soaked in ice water. Tommy Morrison, really? I muttered. Headed to Salt Lake, and his smile widened. Oh, I go wherever the road takes me. It's not about destinations. It's about who you meet along the way.
The conversation dragged like barbed wire across skin. He spoke in riddles about cargo that needed special handling, about deliveries for very particular clients, where when I asked what he actually hauled, his eyes flashed. Let's just say it's not the kind of stuff you'd list on a manifest. Hey, Tommy, Carl said as I headed toward the door. We're both heading north. Why don't we convoy for a bit? Keep each other company on the CB. Every cell in my body screamed no, but my mouth betrayed me. But sure, I'm on Channel 19.
Perfect. His grin now felt more like a threat than a smile. I'll be right behind you, watching your back. You never know what's out there in the dark, and
I left Murphy's Lot, feeling like I'd swallowed a box of nails. Did I imagine the way Carl watched me? His headlights appeared in my mirrors like twin predators, pacing me at a distance that felt intentional, close enough to unsettle, far enough to deny paranoia. The CB radio crackled. Hey there, Tommy boy. This is your new road buddy, Carl. Beautiful night, isn't it? So quiet. Perfect for getting to know each other better. I keyed the mic reluctantly, but sure, it's a quiet night. Light traffic. I love light traffic, he replied. Fewer witnesses, fewer complications. I laughed nervously and didn't respond. My hands gripped the wheel a little tighter. Carl asked about my family, where I lived, which routes I favored. I kept answers vague, but his tone changed from friendly to clinical, like he was checking boxes, building a profile. I'm expanding my operation, he said, looking for people with a strong stomach, the kind who don't ask too many questions. What exactly do you haul, Carl? I finally asked. His voice came back cold. Rare specimens. Things that shouldn't exist. Things people pay handsomely to never see. I felt my pulse throb in my temples. There was nothing casual about the way he said it. You're getting jittery, Carl said. Your driving's off. Maybe pull over. There's a rest area at mile marker 137. Very private. We could chat. His voice shifted again. Deeper, heavier, like it wasn't just Carl anymore, like something inside him was speaking directly to the primitive part of me that still remembered how to run from predators. And against all logic, I felt my hands begin to steer toward the off-ramp. I gritted my teeth, fighting the pull. It was like trying to swim against a whirlpool. My truck swerved but stayed on the road. Sweat poured from my scalp. In my mirror, Carl's Peterbilt loomed larger. As he drew closer, I realized Carl was no longer alone. There were shapes in the sleeper cab, but moving shapes, wrong shapes. Figures with too many joints, too little symmetry. One leaned forward and pressed what used to be a face against the glass, licking it with a tongue lined in barbs. Its eyes found mine. I felt a pulse in my skull like it was knocking, asking to come in. I fumbled the emergency Mayday, I-80 eastbound, mile 130, being pursued by hostile individuals. Request assistance. Silence, just static. Carl was jamming the signal. They were isolating me. Carl's truck swerved to the left, riding beside mine. Through the passenger window, I saw his face, or what had become of it. His skin was ashen, his mouth stretched inhumanly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. The figures behind him squirmed like insects in a jar. He spoke through the CB again. You can't run forever, Tommy. We know where you live. We know your family. You will stop eventually, and we'll be there.
And then they brought out the net, shifting thing made of something alive. I knew what it was for. They wanted to take me alive.
Desperation breeds clarity. I remembered something, a crossover ramp 5 miles back. If I could bait them into overshooting me. I hit the brakes. Carl's truck surged forward, overshooting. I cut hard across the median, tires biting gravel, barely staying upright. Behind me, Carl's rig twisted, too bulky, too heavy. Dust exploded. The monster truck skidded sideways, nearly tipping. I didn't wait to see what happened. I gunned it back west, toward Murphy's, toward people, witnesses. But Murphy's was gone.
Lights off, doors locked, no Dolores, no jukebox hum, like the place had never existed.
Carl had help. Maybe Murphy's was always a lure, a trap designed to feel old and safe. I kept driving. Salt Lake came into view. Bars, traffic, signal. I called 911. They listened and promised to check the mile marker. But I knew better. There'd be nothing left to find. I delivered the shipment, but I was never the same. I avoid Nevada now, keep a weapon under the seat, talk less on the CB, and I warn other truckers. Some laugh, others nod. Eyes haunted. Some disappear weeks later. Carl's still out there, but oh, so are the others, wearing our faces, riding clean rigs, preying on the culture of the road. If a stranger ever offers to convoy with you at night, don't. The radio had gone dead. Bunton. No chatter on Channel 19, no weather updates, a late-night comedy from bored truckers. Just a low, vibrating hum, like a pressure building behind my ears. I switched channels. Nothing. The world outside my windshield was blacktop and silence. I tried music, and even that failed. The stereo blinked, reset itself, and refused to play. It was like I'd slipped off the map entirely, into some no-man's land where machines forgot how to behave. Still with me, Tommy boy? Carl's voice oozed through the CB, softer now, almost intimate.
You did well back there, and smart to run, but I admire persistence even more. I didn't answer. Just gripped the wheel tighter and drove faster.
The thing is, I knew what he wanted now. It wasn't my truck or the freight. It was me. Not for revenge, not even for pleasure, but for purpose. I was cargo. Not long ago, I'd heard a tale from another trucker in El Paso. He talked about a missing guy named Richie. Said Richie picked up a deadhead convoy in Arizona. Never made his delivery. No wreckage, no signal. Just gone. Like the air swallowed him.
At the time, I thought it was desert ghost story nonsense. But now, with Carl behind me, I realized something chilling.
That story didn't sound like fiction anymore. At a fuel depot north of Ely, I pulled over. Not because I needed gas, but because my trailer felt heavier than it should have. Something had changed. The ride was off like something had been added. I went around back and opened the cargo door slowly. Flashlight gripped tight in my fist.
Nothing?
Just boxes of electronics shrink-wrapped to pallets, unopened, sealed. But as I stood there, light sweeping across the bay, I felt it, a pressure behind the eyes again. Stronger now, a migraine that vibrated against my thoughts.
I slammed the door shut.
Back in the cab, I realized the weight wasn't in the trailer, it was in me.
I made a choice that night I never thought I'd make.
I turned off the highway, left the route, detoured toward nowhere, back roads through dead farmland, then gravel paths into canyons that had no names on maps. If Carl was following, he'd have to work for it. I drove through the dark until my own headlights started flickering, until the desert began to close in like a throat.
Then I stopped.
Just long enough to grab my phone, crawl out of the cab, and climb to the top of a rock ridge. There, surrounded by stars and silence, I did the only thing that still felt human. I screamed. Back in the truck, I tried again to call for help. Nothing. Still no signal. I was beginning to think this wasn't just technological interference. This was deliberate isolation. And then, once again, came the voice.
You can detour. You can hide. But Tommy, I am the road. Wherever you drive, I'm already ahead.
I stared into my mirrors.
And there he was.
His truck crept into view behind me. No engine sound, no dust, no lights. Just shape, shadow, and motion. You've been chosen, not as prey, but as potential. Carl said, you could be like us. It's a promotion, really. I hit the gas. My rig growled back to life, and we barreled deeper into the canyon roads. I weaved past boulders and narrow cliffs. No GPS, no signs, just my instincts and fear. Behind me, Carl's headlights slithered. They didn't bounce, didn't flicker, just two orbs of steady white flame that refused to blink. He was toying with me.
"You've already been marked," he said. "You shook my hand. You looked into my passenger's eyes. The rest is inevitable."
And then I remembered Dolores.
Her warning. That one's been coming in here for months. Always alone. Always asking about other drivers. Something ain't right about him.
I reached a cliffside pullout, just enough space for a truck to stop. I killed the engine and killed the lights.
Total blackness. I waited. Nothing. No headlights. No voice.
No Carl. For the first time in hours, it was quiet. I opened the door slowly and stepped down. The rocks beneath my boots shifted. The wind cut sharp.
Then I saw it.
Not Carl, not his truck, but something else.
A figure standing at the edge of the cliff, watching.
Its jaw opened like paper being torn in reverse, and inside I saw dozens of moving mouths, each whispering versions of my name.
That's when I realized Carl wasn't the only one.
There were more like him, other drivers, other rigs, other roads.
They didn't hunt at random. They were methodical. They'd be patterned, organized.
They had rules, territories, routines.
And I'd broken one.
By surviving, I sprinted back to the cab and started the engine. It roared reluctantly, then settled. I flipped the lights. The figure was gone. But the shadows along the road, they moved like they had purpose now. Driving again. No plan, just motion. My GPS turned on for the first time in hours, but the screen showed no roads, just a pulsating red dot. Me, floating in darkness. And then the screen blinked once and read, route recalculating, destination, initiation point.
My CB lit up. The static this time, it had rhythm, like breathing. Carl's voice returned, but fractured. Not words, just fragments.
Between miles, between men, between moments, my steering wheel vibrated with every syllable. I didn't know whether to stop or keep driving forever. Eventually I pulled into a way station, abandoned. Inside, I found what looked like a locker room, but every wall was covered in driver's licenses, thousands of them, laminated, numbered, pinned like butterflies in a collection. Some faces I recognized, trucker buddies, forum friends, guys who'd vanished from Facebook 6 months ago. All labeled, transported. All of them had convoyed. I added Carl's name to the list in my notebook, underlined it. Next to it, I wrote, he hunts for talent. I made it to Utah by dawn, filed a full report. Cops nodded politely, typed everything up, promised to check it out. But their eyes, they had that glazed look people get when their brains protect them from truths they can't handle. They would find nothing. Carl was long gone. So was Murphy's last stop. The highway swallowed them again. Now, I keep to busy roads.
Avoid Nevada.
Never convoy. I started a podcast anonymously, Rigged Realities. There are not many listeners, but some reach out, share similar stories, disappear later. I think Carl's expanding. They don't just need cargo anymore. They need drivers.
One's Hula Bay.
3 nights later, I parked at a rest area outside Cheyenne. Wyoming? Just a normal place. Clean restrooms, vending machines. The occasional long hauler stretching their legs. It was the first time I'd stopped voluntarily since the Murphy's incident. I locked up, stretched, and checked my messages.
That's when I saw it. An airdropped file. No name, no sender, just one word, convoy.
I opened it. My own dashcam footage, except it was footage I never recorded. The camera's view wasn't mine. It showed my rig from the outside, from above.
The angle was impossible. I deleted it, turned off my phone, didn't sleep a second.
I've learned this much. They come quicker when you dream. I don't know if they enter through your thoughts, or if sleep thins the walls between worlds, but every time I've drifted off, I've seen them, the teeth, the rooms without corners, the writhing halls of machinery that pulsed like muscle. Sometimes I see Carl standing by a window while watching me.
Once, I heard a voice say, "Promotion accepted."
I woke up with blood on my palm, mine, fingernail marks where I'd clawed my own hand to stay awake. I started dosing on caffeine and no sleep pills, or anything to keep the dreams away. But they always found new ways in. I hit a diner just past Grand Junction. Real food, real people. It was noisy, warm, safe. Or so I thought. My waitress, a teenager with nervous hands, paused halfway through taking my order. She looked past me toward the window, paled.
You brought one of them here, didn't you? She whispered. They don't like to be ignored. I turned. No one there. When I looked back, the girl was gone.
Another woman, older, brought me my coffee.
Don't talk to the help when they're in between, she said softly. The in-betweeners draw attention.
I left the food untouched and drove until my tires begged for mercy. I met another trucker at a way station outside Denver. Big guy, beard like a lumberjack, name was Loom. He listened to my story without laughing, without blinking.
Then he showed me something.
A small steel coin, no markings, no weight, cold like deep ocean water. He held it in a napkin, said he found it under his seat after convoying with someone who never gave a name. They're marking people now, Lou said, pre-selecting, tagging us like livestock. He burned the coin that night, or tried to.
It didn't melt.
It screamed, not in sound, but in thought.
The next morning, Lou was gone, his rig still parked, Glenmort's engine still warm.
I've started noticing things others don't, like how some trucks have plates that don't register, or how certain rigs only drive between midnight and dawn. Some leave no tire marks.
Some never stop for gas.
And some are driven by people whose faces never change, ever. Even in passing. In mirrors or reflective crow, I see it. Their true shapes blur at the edges, like reality is struggling to hold them in focus. And sometimes, at fuel stops, I hear the asphalt itself whisper, "Join the line, join the long convoy." I once stopped at a trucker memorial in Utah. Crosses lined up for every driver lost on the job. Tornadoes, crashes, sleep deprivation. Some stories etched in stone, others forgotten. But there, under one of the wooden crosses, I saw something scratched into the concrete.
I rode with Carl and I saw them. If you read this, run.
Next to it was a symbol, 3 linked triangles forming a circle. I've seen that same symbol since, spray-painted on underpasses, carved into bathroom stalls, once even etched into frost on my windshield. It's a warning, or a promise, or both. About a month after Murphy's, I got a letter, real ink, real paper.
No return address.
Inside, one sentence. You passed the trial. We're ready to offer employment. Attached, a map with a red X near Great Basin. The spot was a dirt road turnoff. No towns nearby, no signals.
I never went.
But I've passed the exit.
Every time I do, my truck slows down as if something inside it wants to turn, even when I don't.
The wheel resists me just for a second, but enough.
Enough to make me wonder, what would happen if I just let it steer itself? I don't sleep much these days, and I don't accept convoys.
I keep a burner CB set to channel 27. That's where others like me broadcast, quiet voices in the void. We share stories, warnings, signals.
Not many of us left.
But those who survived, the ones who've looked into the eyes of cargo that shouldn't exist, we know the truth. The road isn't empty at night. It's feeding. And the hunters wear our uniforms, drive our rigs and speak like our friends. So if you ever pull into a truck stop and feel something watching you, keep your engine running and don't look back. I was somewhere outside Rawlins when the CB came alive again.
Not static, not Carl's voice.
A woman, calm, slow, each word deliberate. Breaker 19, if you're hearing this, you've been tagged. You have 48 hours to change your route. 48. Do not stop at any location without at least 2 other drivers present. Do not. Her voice cut out. Static swallowed the channel. I tried to respond, but my mic button jammed. Not stuck, held down, as if an invisible hand pressed it.
Then another voice slid in. Silk over steel.
She's not supposed to talk to you yet, Tommy.
Carl.
That night, the desert stretched so far it felt like it was folding in on itself. I drove past the same billboard 3 times in an hour, a faded ad for a motel chain that hadn't existed since the 90s. Each time I passed it, there was a different truck parked under it. First, a rusted Kenworth, then a gleaming Volvo, then something that wasn't a truck at all, but a long, black shape with no lights, no wheels. And yet, it was moving. On the third pass, I saw them lined up in the distance, a convoy stretching to the horizon, every rig spaced perfectly, headlights fixed on a point I couldn't see.
They weren't stopping, ever.
I pulled over at a dirt track and killed my lights, hoping they'd pass. They didn't. The convoy slowed, stopped. Every cab door opened in unison, and figures stepped out.
They didn't walk toward me.
They didn't have to. The air itself bent, folding the space between us like a map being creased. In less than a blink, the first of them was standing at my door.
It wasn't Carvedy, but it had his smile.
"We've been patient," it said. "The road needs more keepers. We can make you one of us. All you have to do is drive."
I wish I could tell you I slammed the door and floored it. I didn't. I sat there, engine idling, staring at the figure, at the convoy, at the endless ribbon of road behind them.
Part of me wanted to know what it meant to be a keeper, to stop running, to stop being prey.
But then I remembered Dolores, the kid waitress in Grand Junction, and I knew once you said yes, you didn't get to be human anymore.
So I closed my eyes, gripped the wheel, and whispered to myself,
Not tonight.
When I opened my eyes, the road was empty. No convoy, no figure,
Just stars.
and the low hum of my engine, waiting for me to decide which way to turn. Story number 7. They were always heading north. Always. That was the first thing I noticed. I've seen all kinds of strange things in my 19 years on the road, but that pattern, it was unnatural. People wandering along the interstate shoulder in the middle of the night, all walking against traffic, in single file. It wasn't just eerie, it felt deliberate, like a ritual I wasn't supposed to see. It started with one figure, a kid in pajamas with walking like he had somewhere to be. The moment I saw him in my headlights, I felt the temperature drop, not outside, inside me, like something old had reached into my chest and squeezed. He didn't look up when I passed, just stared ahead, walking with that same calm rhythm I would later see again and again. Then came the woman in the hospital gown. She looked like my grandmother the last time I saw her. Thin, pale, skin hanging loose on her bones. Only difference? Grandma had been dead for 7 years. This woman smiled at me as I slowed down. A perfect, unmoving smile. Eyes lit up like headlights themselves. And her teeth were so white they looked fake. I floored the gas and didn't look back. By the time I reached mile marker 42, I had seen at least a dozen more, each one stranger than the last. School kids, businessmen, old men with canes, all walking in silence, but they didn't flag me down, didn't acknowledge the roaring 18-wheeler passing them by, and no shadows, no signs of being alive. And yet, they moved. When the radio finally crackled with someone else confirming what I was seeing, I thought I was safe. But that was the beginning. That's when I realized this wasn't just a hallucination. Others had seen them too. Some had even tried to stop. One said he'd passed the same man 3 times in different towns. Another followed them to an abandoned rest stop where they vanished. I should have turned around right then. The night had been typical. Humid, sticky, suffocating. I'd just passed Valdosta, Georgia, when I felt something shift in the air. There was no breakdown, no sign of fatigue, just that uneasy churn in my gut, like I was being watched. I pulled over, letting the engine settle into silence. The only sound left was the dull buzz of heat rising from the asphalt. Marcus had encountered his first shoulder walker about an hour earlier, an elderly woman in a faded hospital gown, shuffling along the gravel shoulder near Valdosta. She moved like she was floating, barely touching the ground. My instinct screamed at me to drive, but my heart, it wanted to help. That was always my problem. Too much heart, not enough sense. I slowed down, rolled my window halfway, and prepared to ask if she needed help. She reminded him of his late grandmother, and his first instinct had been to stop and offer assistance. But something about the woman's posture and movement had triggered his survival instincts. Then she turned to face me. Her eyes glowed like a predator's, wide and gleaming with something not of this world. I didn't wait for her to speak. I hit the gas and watched her in my rearview mirror, resuming her walk like nothing had happened. That smile, still carved into her face. I told myself it was exhaustion. I'd been running long hours lately, too many double shifts, and maybe I'd even fallen asleep with my eyes open, but that didn't explain what came next. They began appearing regularly, every few miles, every kind of person, each walking north. Same posture, same pace, none of them casting shadows. I'd been on I-75 1,000 times before, and I'd never seen anything like it. CB Channel 19 had always been my lifeline, a way to stay sane out there in the dark. Endless roads of the South. When I keyed in and asked if anyone else had seen the walkers, I expected silence, maybe a joke. What I got instead was confirmation. Breaker 19, this is southbound I-75 at mile marker 42. Anyone else seeing pedestrians on the shoulder tonight? Yeah, I copy that, driver. Been seeing them for the past 100 miles. Strangest damn thing I ever witnessed. More voices chimed in. Drivers as far north as Tennessee. One guy swore he'd followed them to a rest stop that didn't even exist on modern maps. Another had tried to pick up a little girl in a nightgown, only to have her stare through him like glass. One comment froze my blood. I passed the same old man 3 times tonight. Same clothes, same walk, same everything. That wasn't possible. Not unless he'd been driving in circles, which he hadn't. I didn't know if I was terrified or relieved. I wasn't alone in seeing them. But if this many drivers were experiencing the same thing, then it wasn't hallucination. It was organized, intentional. One voice stood out, calm, deep, with a hollow tone. Recruitment, he said. Well, we're always looking for new team members, you see, people like you.
I didn't remember hearing him join the channel. There's no breaker call. Just there, like he'd always been listening.
I kept the rig at a steady crawl, letting the beams lift the world in slices. The radio hissed and fell quiet. The trees stood like a congregation bowing to something I couldn't see. I told myself I was gathering proof. That if I drove slow enough and close enough, what I found would finally make sense. The truth was simpler. I couldn't let the unknown keep living in my head rent-free. I needed to look it in the eye. About 5 miles up the road, his headlights illuminated a man in his 40s wearing a business suit that looked like it had been expensive once, but was now stained and torn. He didn't stumble. He didn't check his footing. His briefcase swung perfectly in time with his steps, like a metronome set to a human heart that never sped up. I rolled down the passenger window and matched his pace. Need a lift? I asked. This shoulder isn't built for long journeys. He turned his face toward me, and my regret hit me before my eyes finished focusing, skin pale enough to reflect my dashlights, cheekbones carved hard, pupils too steady. There was a smile there, slight, like he had solved a private riddle and was waiting for me to catch up. Thank you for your concern, he said, but I have somewhere I need to be, and we all do.
Where is that? I asked. My voice came out steady. I have years of practice pretending I'm fine.
His smile widened a fraction. North, always north, to the place where the walking ends and the real work begins. The air inside the cab tightened, as if the whole truck drew a breath and held it. What kind of work? I asked, already bracing for an answer I didn't want. The kind that requires fresh volunteers, Bob, he said. And this time his tone rang through me like a migraine behind the eyes. People like you, who stopped to help strangers in the night, like people who ask too many questions. The glow started gradually, like the reflection of distant taillights sliding across glass. And then I realized it wasn't reflection at all. His eyes were emitting their own light, and his pupils changed shape. 2 vertical slits that swallowed the center of each eye. His smile deepened, and for a heartbeat I saw rows of teeth behind the first row. a mouth designed to hold more than a human could. I dropped the window and buried the throttle. The cab lurched and the trailer snapped tight. In my side mirror, he dwindled to a pin in the darkness. Relief ran through me and then died just as quickly, because the pin didn't shrink anymore. The man wasn't walking or running. He was simply present, keeping pace without moving, like the road itself delivered him. The CB spat his voice into the cab, calm as an air-conditioned office. "You can't outrun us, Marcus. We know your name, your route, your destination. We've been watching you for a long time, waiting for the right moment to extend our invitation." I gripped the mic hard enough to ache. "How do you know my name?" "Recruitment," he said. "We're always looking for new team members. People who understand the importance of helping others find their true purpose." "What purpose?" "To guide the ones who are ready," he said. "To walk them to the threshold and hand them forward." I didn't answer. The trees blurred. My breath fogged the inside of the window. For the first time in 2 decades on the road, I felt like the highway had been laid not for me to travel, but for me to be moved along like a package on a belt. I turned the radio down and drove north anyway. The curve announced itself before the signs did. Something about the angle of the stars, the way the straightaways had been too generous for too long, told me the road was about to change its mind, far ahead, beyond the bend. A haze like stadium lighting hovered over the asphalt. It wasn't headlights. It didn't flare. It glowed. "Talk to me," I told the empty channel. "Anybody up here?" Silence. And then a crowd speaking with one voice. "You're approaching the collection point. Marcus, don't be afraid. The transition's quite painless." I came out of the curve and the world opened like a door into a room I didn't recognize. Shoulder walkers stood in ranks across both lanes. Marching lines turned into a wall, hundreds of them, maybe more, arranged with the precision of a ceremony that had been rehearsed longer than the interstate had existed. The glow I'd seen wasn't light alone. It was their eyes, that soft, unblinking hue, mapping the dark. I braked and let the rig settle 40 or 50 yards away. The hazard lights pulsed uselessly against their faces. They looked peaceful. They looked complete. And then I recognized people. Old drivers, familiar jawlines and ball caps, and the posture of men who had spent their lives sitting high in wind, men who had simply stopped answering calls months back. The same empty peace lived on their faces now, and whatever it was, it had eaten their names clean. The businessman was at my window without crossing the distance. One blink, and he was there, leaning as if gravity was a suggestion, close. His skin was translucent, the veins beneath moving like ivy in a breeze. So his tie lay flat even though there was a wind. His voice was closer to my thoughts than to my ears. "Welcome to the end of your journey, Marcus," he said, "and the beginning of your real purpose. Step out of the truck and let us show you what you've been missing all these years on the road." The worst part was how good it sounded. I was tired. Tired of metal and schedules, of sleeping along fences of sodium lights, of waking unsure which town my body had chosen in the night. The crowd promised something other than that. They promised to hold my weight in the places I'd been carrying it alone.
But that promise had a cost I could feel in my bones. My independence has always been my last dry match, and I could give up miles. Money? Time? Not that.
I found reverse and squeezed. The trailer rocked as the rig began to back. The walkers moved in unison without changing expression, flowing to close the space like a tide recapturing sand. Their coordination was wrong. It was beyond training. It was a single mind rearranging itself. Their lines rippled. Mine broke. I yanked the wheel, carved a U where a U wasn't welcome, and fed the engine everything. The rig pivoted, howled, and found the southbound lanes. The formation behind me did not collapse. It turned as one and came after me. Most people find it rather liberating. Actually, the businessman said over the radio, the same line repeating on multiple channels like a house, with the same voice in every room. No more decisions to make, no more responsibilities to worry about. I stopped listening and drove. The highway became a ribbon I couldn't pull fast enough. The walkers didn't run, they simply advanced at a speed that didn't match the math. One moment they were distant, the next they had shortened the gap without appearing to move faster. The lanes belonged to them, the median belonged to them. The woods carried their shadows even if the pavement would not. Where do you end? I asked. No one. What stops you? The CB answered, we have agents throughout the highway systems. Every truck stop, every way station, every rest area. The businessman's tone was a comfort sold in a dangerous bottle. You can't drive forever. He was right. No driver outlasts the road. The body fails. Fuel runs thin. Tires heat and soften, then fail you at the worst minute. I did the arithmetic and saw only bad remainders. So I changed the problem. I shut off the CB. I cut the cabin lights. I killed anything that let them into my cab without my permission. I talked out loud, old habit, to keep my fear from speaking for me. I set my jaw against the idea that I was prey. In the mirrors, though, the assembly thickened like fog with intent. 3 figures slid ahead of the mass, then 6, then 9. They didn't gesture, they didn't confer. They simply shaped the space around me, guiding me toward an exit I hadn't planned to take. The sign ahead had no number. Its letters had been bleached out by sun and time, but the arrow was perfectly clear. I took it. The ramp curled into darkness and then into a 2-lane that stitched through pine. The walkers did not thin. They met me in the trees, they kept to the shoulders. They kept to the ditches. They kept to any path that allowed them to remain astride from the asphalt. As if the blacktop carried a rule they wouldn't break. I remembered something then from the rest area rumor, the driver who said they vanished into walls. If the old infrastructure was part of their territory, maybe the lines that weren't meant for vehicles, the boundaries and edges, the places just off the path, were where they had the most power. So I did the opposite. I put every ounce of weight, dead center, in the lane. I held the wheel like it was the only honest thing I owned. I whispered a promise to myself. I would not touch the shoulder again. The sky began to pale, but not morning yet. But the darkness wasn't a complete sentence anymore. The walkers started to lag. The mass behind me thinned into lines and then into points, as if daylight diluted whatever held them together. I didn't slow until the pines gave way to billboards, and the billboards gave way to a river of lanes and signs that talked in numbers again. I kept south. I let the day build over me like scaffolding. At the next staffed station, I parked among bodies and voices. I walked inside with hands that still wanted a wheel. The clerk watched me the way people watch strays deciding whether to bolt. I asked for a landline. I called the state police. I reported what I had seen in detail and without drama. The way you report a jackknifed rig or a fire, I gave mile markers, I gave landmarks, and I gave my names. The dispatcher listened politely. Then she told me there had been no unusual calls. I had no closures, no gatherings, no pedestrians. The Georgia State Police had no record of any unusual activity on the 75, she said. And her voice wasn't covering anything. It was the confidence of a system that believed its own paperwork. I called my dispatcher, same answer, dressed in corporate casual. Everyone accounted for, all lanes open, trucks tracking normally, no alerts. I hung up and stood in the doorway and watched the late morning traffic bloom. My reflection in the glass looked older than I'd last checked. If the walkers were a system, then they had a back office. Somebody, or something, was patching the holes. Records were being made to agree with a world that wasn't agreeing with itself. They didn't have to stop you if they could erase you. They didn't have to convince the living if they could edit the story. I bought a notebook. I wrote down everything I remembered while the edges were still wet. The walkers' spacing, their uniform pace, the way they avoided the center ribbon of the road. The way the suits like to speak in absolutes. I wrote the phrases that had lodged in my head and would not move. I copied them like warnings on a map. That night I didn't drive alone. I found a small convoy headed my direction and asked to tuck in. Men and women I knew by voice and handle watched my mirrors and I watched theirs. We ran the speed of agreement. We stopped where there were people and light. We took turns staying awake while others closed their eyes for an hour. There were no walkers that night. Told myself it was the route. I told myself it was daylight. Told myself anything that would let me sleep. Days turned into a pattern. Convoy when the sun fell, centered lanes, shoulders treated like venom, 2 phones, paper maps in the door pocket in case the screen started lying, a habit of counting faces at the diners, of looking for smiles that didn't reach the eyes. In quiet moments, guilt came for me. I'd always pulled over for people on the side of the road, a flat tire under rain, a stranded family under stars. A man bent over a steaming hood with nowhere to go. That was the code out here. You help, because you might be the next one needing it. Now I drove past with my hands at 10 and 2 and my mouth a hard line. And I could feel the old version of me watching and judging. But then I would see it again in memory, the business suit, the pale teeth, the eyes bright as insect wings, and I would let the judgment pass. Not all faces are an invitation. From that night forward, Marcus never drove alone on isolated highways after dark. He started traveling in convoys with other truckers, and he always carried multiple forms of communication. That sentence wrote itself into my life like a policy. I wish the story ended there. I wish caution closed the book, but the road keeps its own calendar and its own debts. Story number 8. I woke to a pressure in the air, the way a river hums under ice before it breaks. I kept my breathing steady, because prey broadcasts panic and I wasn't going to feed anything tonight. Something had chosen my rig, my name, my pulse. I reached for the light, then stopped. Hunters look for sudden suns. Survivors learn to see in the dark. The road teaches in quiet sentences. I listened. The banging started, and I felt it through the mattress before I heard it. 3 thunderous impacts against the right side of his Kenworth, each one powerful enough to rock the entire rig. I had parked off the main flow, nose toward a sagging tree line, trailer squared. Derek's first thought was that another truck had sideswiped him. That was my first thought too, before the quiet settled in like a heavy coat. No brake squeal, no panicked footsteps, no apology or curse, just the echo of force, the memory of mass. I lifted my head and stared at the window until it offered me back a smear of my own face, and nothing more. I rolled out of the bunk, boots planted, bat in reach. I'd been running long enough to tally the near misses, tires that surrendered at highway heat, belts that stitched themselves apart, engines that begged for mercy. But what I felt wasn't failure, it was assessment. A knock the way a locksmith learns a door. The lot was nearly empty except for 2 other big rigs parked about 100 yards ahead of him, a red Freightliner and a white Volvo, their running lights like watched embers. I thumbed the CB anyway. Habit is a life jacket. Breaker 19, back row. Anyone else feeling knocks? Static, braided into a voice like gravel that had learned to speak. Yeah, I copy that, driver. Been hearing it for the past 10 minutes. Something's pounding on all our trucks, but I can't see what's doing it. A second voice braided in, younger, wire tense, claiming movement at the edge. My skin tightened the way wire tightens when you pull fence straight. The cab shivered again. Left side this time, perfectly spaced and delivered with tremendous force. The rhythm had intent. You can tell when metal is settling and when something is sending a message. This was a message tapped with patience. I eased the door and stepped down into a rest area the state had forgotten. Grass tufted through the asphalt like stubborn memories. The building crouched with its back to the highway. windows filmed with a gloss of old rain. I played the beam along the trailer skin and saw it. There were handprints on the side of his trailer, dozens of them, pressed into the metal as if the aluminum had been soft clay, not dense, pressed, human in general outline, wrong in execution, fingers the length of cigarettes and palms too narrow, set in overlapping arrays like a study gone wrong. I dropped the light to the dirt fringe and found footprints in the dirt that didn't negotiate with categories. 18 inches long at least, clawed where toes ought to be, stride length nearly 6 feet. Hunters make themselves efficient. These had evolved for long ground and quiet approaches. I could feel how they moved in the spacing, the angle, a patience I knew too well. Hey guys, I think I see it. There's something moving between the trees at the edge of the lot. It's big, maybe 8 or 9 feet tall, and it's watching us. The white Volvo again, wind in his voice. I sliced the beam into the scrub, and the light found 2 circles that returned it without blinking. Not animal shine, calculation shine. They were positioned too high off the ground, and they didn't wobble the way a deer thinks. They tracked left, right, left, keeping count of us like inventory. I see it too, I said to the mic, throat dry. Whatever it is, it's been checking out our trucks, the older driver answered, voice like someone who'd learned which roads ask for offerings. Boys, I think we need to get out of here. They test your defenses first. The knocks returned, answering each other across the lot. Not quite echo, not quite language, a complex pattern that sounded almost like communication. When the forest replied from farther off, my ribs went cold. Not one, pack. The eyes multiplied inside the black like a cheap constellation map, all at the same unnatural height. Our rigs became islands, and the tide came in on long legs. Then the sound changed, no more knocks, just the calculation of claws scraping against metal as the creatures began climbing onto the trucks. Suspension shifted, roof skins flexed under weight. They were heavy, but deliberate. I climbed back into the cab and locked the door mostly to tell my hands a story about safety. Through the glass, I saw silhouettes pass from trailer to trailer, humanoid in general shape, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent in ways that human joints couldn't accommodate. One dropped from the Freightliner's roof to the pavement in my headlight wash, nearly 9 foot tall with grey mottled skin the colour of dishwater stone. Its arms were disproportionately long and ended in hands that wore too many fingers tipped with claws that gleamed like polished bone. The face looked like a memory of human, stretched until the idea tore. Its eyes were large and completely black pools that took without returning. Its mouth was filled with teeth that looked more suited to tearing meat than compromise. It tilted its head at me like I was a puzzle misassembled, came to the door and began tapping on the window with one elongated finger. The sound, sharp and rhythmic like Morse code. I lifted the mic. They're right outside our trucks. We need to get out of here now. Freightliner came back steady, the way a person gets steady when the alternative is collapse. On my count, we all start our engines. 3, 2, 1, go. 1. I turned the key and brought the heart of the truck up from sleep. The thing at the door didn't retreat. It began pounding on his window with increasing intensity, its claws leaving scratches in the safety glass. I dropped into gear and rolled, and it kept pace without effort. A courier from a place that never invented mercy. More dark bodies peeled from the trees and ran with us. Long shanks eating distance, some trying for the ladders, claws searching for purchase. Out on the slab, the chase stretched. They coordinated without shouting, coordinating by coded signals I felt more than heard, like current in fence wire. The Volvo fishtailed and corrected. The Freightliner held the lane like a priest holds a candle. I pushed the needle until the engine made promises it couldn't keep for long. In the mirrors, I watched them fall away in increments. Elegant, even in loss, as if speed didn't insult them, only interested them. We didn't stop until light and people made the world again. Under the fluorescent canopy, the asphalt felt like a creed. We compared damage, handprints, claw marks, and dents made a gallery down each rig. A story no one would purchase. We tried the law anyway. The uniforms were polite the way a body is polite at a funeral for someone they barely knew. Cameras had malfunctioned during our sprint. Of course they had. That's where most tales stop. A shrug, a warning, a ribbon of rumor for the next driver. But I took the marks personal. The road taught me to read. And last night something wrote on me. I wasn't done with the lesson. I bought maps that still admitted to back roads and found the rest area again in daylight that made its cracks honest. I walked the perimeter slow, like a man counting something he owed. The handprints still scalloped the aluminum where the metal was unmarked by dents, but not by the intention pressed into it. I pressed my palm next to one print and felt the phantom of pressure. Like the metal remembered the fingers that coerced it. The ground told a second story, subsurface compaction, where something weighty had paused to decide. I left offerings of noise, portable motion alarms every 5 yards around my truck, a pattern of reflective strips waist-high along the trailer length, angled to throw any headlamp beams sideways. I rigged a ladder with loose rungs that would swing instead of bear weight. It wasn't about winning, it was about rewriting the test, so the graders had to show more of themselves. When night came, I parked within whispering distance of the same broken light pole. The other 2 drivers from that night met me there. We'd been talking since, the kind of talking that moves from words to action. We placed cameras that didn't care about electromagnetic tantrums and microphones inside steel boxes. I brewed coffee strong enough to make the ground remember the cup. Then we waited, which is a kind of work. They arrived the way cold arrives, first as a suggestion, then as fact. No knocks at the beginning, new behavior, because we had changed the rubric. A shape tested the reflective strips and recoiled not from light, but from the way the beam cut its outline for us to study. Another tried the ladder, caught the swing, and froze mid-movement with an intelligence I could taste. The alarms signaled in sequence. A constellation pattern around the trailer that let us triangulate mass and gait. In their adjustment, I recognized professionals confronting a new security protocol. I spoke out the window, voice steady. "You like tests? Try mine." I played back their earlier complex pattern that sounded almost like communication, reproduced through a speaker with the bass cut, so the rhythm sat naked. The tree line answered in a slightly altered meter. Not a mirror, but a question. Beneath fear, something curious woke in me. They weren't just hunters. They were cartographers of weakness, mapping what humans ignore, blind angles, sleep debt, the one light that never quite works. We showed them a different map. The Freightliner driver flicked on a grid of high-frequency strobes that didn't flash so much as insist. The Volvo idled and then revved, not for speed, but to bleed harmonic resonance along the frame, making the trailer skin hum a note that killed footing. I eased forward 3 feet and back 2, micro-movements that spoiled leaps. The first of them slipped, not far, but enough to show a vulnerability. They disliked uncertainty more than light. They withdrew, not all the way, but into hedge and shadow, eyes riding at that wrong height, thinking. One shifted its weight and the ground betrayed it with the smallest puff of dust. I knew where it would put the next step before it did. The way you know where a chess player feels safest. I tossed a handful of ball bearings there and waited. The step aborted. The eyes turned from black lakes into coins catching thought. I understood something uncomplicated then. The road isn't prey. And we aren't either when we refuse the script. Now, it isn't that monsters stop hunting. It's that they hunt where the test is easiest. Change the test. Change the hunt. We didn't chase them off that night. That isn't the kind of story this is. Instead, we held them at the border of their confidence until dawn put color on the asphalt. They left prints again, new ones intersecting the old, and education for anyone who wanted it. We pulled our equipment, copied files twice, and then we did the most radical thing. We told people the truth in ways they could use, not campfire bravado, playbooks, lists, where to park, how to layer sightlines, why to sleep in phases instead of slabs of oblivion. Word braided through the lanes, station to station, diner to counter, text to text, a network that started with 3 drivers and became a rumor with instructions. They also developed a network of communication, sharing information about dangerous locations and unusual encounters with other truckers who were willing to listen. We didn't name the creatures. Names make mascots. We named the behaviors, the tapping, the ladder test, the side scan. The more we named, the fewer accidents looked like accidents. Weeks later, I passed that forgotten pull-off and watched a pickup ease in at the far end, windows down, music a thin thread. I keyed the mic and spoke the way someone once spoke to me. Don't linger there. Better options 10 miles east. He thanked me without asking why, the way people do when they've seen enough nights to trust warnings that come without drama. I still feel them sometimes when I shut down on quiet shoulders. A calculation in the dark. The road never sleeps, and neither do the things that hunt along its edges, testing our defenses and waiting for the moment when we let our guard down. The difference is this: I don't sleep like prey anymore. I sleep like a man who learned the test and wrote his own questions. Story number 9. There's a kind of silence in the Bitterroot Mountains that makes you feel like the world's holding its breath. And that night, I realized it wasn't the world. It was something waiting for me. I've been on the road for 20 years, but I never thought a stretch of empty highway could look like a hunting ground. The snow wasn't the problem, it was what moved inside it, keeping pace with me for miles and never showing its face until it wanted me to see. Some truckers believe in bad luck, others in bad weather. I believe in what followed me that night because I saw the eyes. Before that night, the mountains were just mountains. After it, they became the place I swore I'd never drive again. I've run timber loads through country where the map runs out. But the night I crossed the Bitterroot, something old treated me like quarry. It wasn't the cold that almost ended me. It was the formation keeping pace just outside the glow of my headlights. Patient and deliberate. Truckers swap stories to stay awake. I never believed any of them until I saw shapes sliding between trees like they owned the dark. Machines have limits. Predators don't. That's the lesson I brought back from the mountains. After that run, every shortcut looked like a snare. I learned to measure distance in breaths, not miles. I drive alone. That's not a confession so much as a habit I earned one winter after I stopped pretending the mountains were just scenery. The road that night looked clean on the dash, a blank promise stretching forward. And I took it because a man with a deadline convinces himself he's stronger than weather and wiser than whatever lives past the guardrail. My rig was heavy with cut timber, the kind that talks to you through the frame and reminds you that gravity has terms you can't renegotiate. I told myself I'd make the delivery and sleep in a motel where the heater rattled and the coffee never cooled. Deadlines are good at sounding like safety. I learned young that a truck will give you exactly what you give it: attention, respect, patience. I kept the cab warm, listened to the engine, read the small movements the way some folks read clouds. The night stretched thin and soundless across the windshield, and the highway climbed like it had a grudge. I remember glancing down at the gauge and thinking about frost in places you don't want frost. It was just past midnight on a frigid February night, which is a pretty way of admitting my timing was poor and my pride worse. The wheel steadied me. The hum in the floorboards felt like a familiar hand on the shoulder. People who don't haul through northern country imagine night drives as loneliness. It's not loneliness, it's an audition. The dark is seeing if you remember the steps. The route through the Bitterroot Mountains was treacherous, even in good weather, with steep grades, hairpin turns, and drop-offs that plunged hundreds of feet into rocky canyons. I knew those switchbacks, like I knew the smell of diesel, and still my knuckles went pale when I caught a sliver of motion skating between the pines. I told myself it was wind in the branches pretending to be shape. Wind lies like that. Hey, something changed about 50 miles back. That's when my gut started writing memos, louder than the radio. At first, it was just a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The sort of itch you get when your instincts file an objection. But miles compound, and so do hunches. I didn't like how the timberline kept pace with me as if it were on rails. I didn't like how the night felt attentive. I backed off the accelerator, then eased back on, testing the space around me like you test ice with a boot heel. My CB did what mountain CBs do, nothing. The CB radio had been silent for hours, and I told myself that was normal. My satellite phone stared back with a dead blank it reserves for valleys. I'd lost cell bars long before the last gas. That kind of isolation tightens a man's breath. You start rehearsing a plan you hope you won't have to use. You count exits you can't see. You memorize the empty lanes behind you. The first hard proof didn't come in sound. It came in print. The beam touched the shoulder and there they were, slashed across the powder alongside the road like a signature. The tracks were large, easily twice the size of human footprints, and they ran parallel to the lane, unhurried, long-striding, too clean for comfort. I measured them against the snowfall in my head and realized they were fresh, new enough that the drift hadn't swallowed their edges. I put my boot down. The engine answered with a low, steady promise. I've been skeptical my whole life. When a story gets strange, I check my pulse, then my mirrors. This time the mirrors gave me what I asked for and more. Shapes moving in cadence with the truck, not breaking branches, not tripping, just sliding with a confident economy that said they knew that ground better than I knew my own floorboards. They crisscrossed the highway, disappeared into the forest, and reappeared on the other side. Not random, not curious, methodical. I tasted that coin flip moment every driver meets where you decide whether you've invented a fear or discovered one. The strike came without preface. The cab lurched right as if something had shoved it with a shoulder the size of a stump. Something large struck the passenger side of his cab with tremendous force, rocking the entire truck and spiderwebbing the window. I corrected, light on the brake, firm through the frame, fighting the slide that wanted to make a home in the guardrail. The rig straightened because I begged it to, not because the road forgave me. In that crooked second between impact and recovery, I saw it. A figure running level with my door. Built wrong in a way that made sense only to the cold. Long limbs, heavy coat of dark that glittered with ice. A face, map from both us and not us. The sort of engineering you'd get if winter learned anatomy. More of them appeared the way night reveals stars. You look once and there are two, look again and there are six. They did not waste movement. They did not posture. They arranged themselves with patience, or they ran in formation, spacing each other. One settling on the trailer roof with a surety that turned sheet metal into ladder rungs, its weight causing the suspension to groan and the entire rig to sway dangerously. Not a crash, just a slow pressure, reminding me of physics I could not negotiate away. I reached for the emergency channel because that's what a rulebook insists you do. Mayday, Mayday. This is northbound on Highway 95, mile marker unknown. I'm under attack by unknown hostiles. Request immediate assistance. The speaker flickered and said nothing intelligible. Mountains are efficient at silence. The weight above me moved forward with an easy assurance I didn't appreciate. In the mirrors, a shadow grew, short, then long, and I knew its aim before it reached the fuel tanks. Diesel is a lifeline in that cold. A torn lifeline in that cold is a verdict. I introduced the truck to a zigzag I've never written into a logbook. Swerve, recover, swerve. The trailer drifted toward open space where the land stopped pretending to hold you, then settled when the chains bit the ice the way they're meant to. The thing on the roof held as if the metal were part of its world. I refused to lend the night any more words than it deserved. I watched the margins for intention, and that's when I understood the worst of it. This wasn't a chase, it was a shepherding. Every exit I considered closed itself, and every time he tried to change direction or take an alternate route, they would appear to block his path. Not with chaos, but with choreography. That kind of discipline doesn't happen by accident. Somebody had taught them a map. They were intelligent, organized, and experienced in hunting vehicles on these mountain roads. The engine temp ticked higher as I demanded more than the grade wanted to give. The steering became sluggish, not from failure, but from the math of weight and angle the pack had forced on me. The world narrowed to a lane, a cliff, and a plan I didn't like, and the formation drew in, not to finish me, but to funnel me toward a point I could not see. I recognized the tactic from training videos where people in uniforms taught you how crowds control a single body. They moved with perfect coordination, like a military unit executing a well-rehearsed operation. I topped a rise and, far off, saw the low burn of a small town stitched along the valley. Hope tends to shout. I let it shout. I made noise with lights and horn, made the night watch me, made the town acknowledge me. Crossing into that light felt like stepping out of deep water. The shapes peeled back into trees as if a curtain had been drawn, and I was no longer interesting. The roof lightened, the frame sighed. I kept my hands on the wheel after I parked behind a diner. Stillness can be a decision. The deputy who took my statement later did the job he had. He offered reasonable explanations and a promise that rest fixes eyes. I nodded because he hadn't been on my road, and because sometimes the truth is heavier than a man needs to carry to his shift. Daylight looks like mercy until you try to use it. I returned with a trooper and pointed at the shoulder and the canyon and said, "There." They found brush laid oddly, tracks that didn't match the usual crosses, interruptions where patterns should have been, nothing fit for headlines. The official paper prefers ordinary nouns. Mine didn't. I changed routes. I added time. I learned the comfort of crowded highways where radios carry and phones behave, but the pattern pressed at me like a draft under a door. I read reports in motel rooms, traced maps, followed stories told in coffee steam, a figure staged in a lane that wasn't a person, aid that wasn't aid, detours that weren't accidents. Truckers across the country had reported encounters that people with clipboards filed under fatigue and weather. Maybe some of them were. Too many wore the same shape. You want a saying? I don't have one that fits on a cap, and I have a list. Respect terrain, respect weather, respect the possibility that intelligence wears unfamiliar faces. They were intelligent, organized, and patient, capable of planning complex operations. Whoever trained them understood us. They learned what a driver does when the world tightens to a set of bad choices. They didn't need strength if they could get there first. That night didn't end with a spotlight and applause. It ended because I refused the road the formation wanted and chose the only one they hadn't planned for, down. If you look at a guardrail and see a boundary, you're a good citizen. If you look at a guardrail and see a path, you're a desperate one. I chose desperate. The impact shook bolts into prayers and turned the windshield into a constellation. Trees caught me the way old netting catches a thrown weight. I woke upside down, patient with my own confusion. Belts and design and dumb luck kept me whole enough to move. I stayed. I used the kit you toss in a cab and hope to never touch. Blankets, water, safe heat. The discipline to count minutes without inventing new fears. Up on the rim, I heard movement that didn't commit to the slope. They preferred the edge where control lived. Dawn softened their presence. Tracks remained where they had peered over and declined the descent. Hours later, a helicopter stitched sound across the canyon. Paper later said weather and fatigue. Paper likes tidy piles, and I don't run the mountains anymore. I run longer. Lower roads where porch lights break up the dark and fuel stations sell soup at 2 in the morning. That choice doesn't make me small. It makes me available tomorrow when I park now. I tell the young ones the generous version of the story. The one without the parts that would keep them awake past their start time. I give them this. Though when a scene appears that feels tailored to your panic, step back, confirm from a distance, refuse the funnel. Months make terror look like exaggeration. So I built a ledger. I recorded nights without clocks, distances measured by shoulder ache, and every choice that kept me drawing air. I laid trucker rumors over road maps and watched patterns thread together, accidents that mirrored each other across states, staged obstructions that drew rigs into blind angles where a shoulder could be controlled. Names changed, choreography didn't. A mechanic in Spokane told me about rigs with gouges along tank shields and roof lines, not from bridges or branches, but from something that understood leverage. Another driver said the snow around his wreck looked patterned, as if feet had written in it. I drove back once to a turnout above the valley and tried to convince myself daylight meant ordinary. It didn't. Print marks on far slopes were too regular, too deliberate, where any animal I knew would have zigged when the ground zagged. I left well before dusk. Schedules matter. I refused theirs. I rebuilt my kit and my habits. Paper maps live under my seat like talismans. I carry lists, hospitals, tow yards, sheriff substations, real people in real places. And if a situation on the road requests my attention, I acknowledge it from the cab, verify it through 2 other signals, then act. Intelligence is layers, so is survival. There's a town at the base of that corridor where windows leak warm squares onto snow. I stayed there a week, writing this down in a room that smelled like lemon and old tobacco, in the diner. I listened to men who learned the mountains before me. One old-timer told me wolves sometimes move elk without sprinting, shaping the herd with pressure and patience. I didn't say what I was thinking. The thing in the trees knew that lesson well. Once, a young deputy asked if I wanted to revise my report. I told him paper already held what he needed. The rest belonged to people who drive. He asked if I thought the thing was human. I told him the better question was whether it was only human. He put his pen down. Sometimes not writing is a kind of respect. If you drive long enough, you'll be offered a night that wants to teach what you didn't ask to learn when it comes. Remember, you're not the first student. Someone already passed the test by surviving. Find their lesson, take it whole. Don't edit it to fit your pride. I keep one souvenir, a map with a hand-drawn line where I left the road. The line looks wrong, and I like it that way. It reminds me that sometimes survival isn't pretty. Sometimes it's choosing the one option that has no audience. I still dream of the shoulder that night, prints arranged like notes, the forest holding its breath. In the dream, I do what I did. Trust the feeling that arrives ahead of reason. Choose the line nobody taught me. The trees catch me again. I wake not in panic, but in resolve. He never drove the Idaho mountain roads again, choosing instead to take a longer route that added 2 hours to his trip. And if that reads like fear to you, so be it. To me, it reads like honoring tuition already paid. The creatures were still out there, still hunting, because the pattern didn't stop. It just learned which drivers wouldn't cooperate anymore. Somewhere up that canyon, a broken frame rests in trees. I could show you where, but I won't. The wilderness never sleeps. And neither do the things that hunt in its deepest, darkest corners. If you remember nothing else, remember this. A highway is not a promise. It's a test you take with your life. And the grader doesn't speak our language. Story number 10. I used to believe the road answered to discipline. Miles, logged, schedules kept, machines maintained. Then an ambulance with a smile too perfect asked me to trust it. And I learned the road also answers to predators dressed like help. The first thing they tried to steal wasn't my rig or my cargo. It was my will. I felt my hands move without me, felt my eyes search for a rest area I hadn't decided to find. Whoever they were, they understood that command can masquerade as compassion. When I looked into that truck's open doors, the tools were arranged with reverence, not for healing, for demonstration, bleeding, measured, fear, graft, consciousness, stretched like wire to see how far it could ring without breaking. And I told myself I was too seasoned for superstition. 16 years on back roads teach a person what's real. The truth is, routine can be a blindfold woven from confidence, like all it takes is one hand in a uniform to lift it. If you ever see an ambulance waiting where the night is thickest, remember me, some uniforms don't promise safety, they promise study. They promise that your life will be examined, taken apart slowly, and never returned to you in working order.
The headlights of Ray's Kenworth cut through the darkness as he navigated the winding back roads of rural Alabama. I say his, but that night, the truck felt more like a stubborn, loyal animal that had followed me for years and was now watching me make one bad decision in slow motion. His trailer loaded with automotive parts bound for a factory in Montgomery. Freight is honest. It doesn't ask for favors and it doesn't pretend to care if you make it on time. People do.
It was a humid September night, and the air was thick with the smell of kudzu and pine sap that drifted through his slightly open window. I'd driven that corridor enough to tell where the swamp began by scent alone. The smell doesn't warn you about what wears a uniform. Ray had been driving these southern routes for 16 years, and he knew every truck stop, every speed trap, and every shortcut between Birmingham and the Gulf Coast. Knowing the map, I'd later learn, is different from knowing the territory. Maps never include ambushes set by kindness. But tonight, Ray wasn't taking his usual route. A massive pileup on I-65 had closed the interstate for hours, forcing him and dozens of other truckers onto the secondary highways that snake through Alabama's rural heartland. Detours are supposed to be temporary. Some become transitions you never fully return from. The route had taken Ray through some of the most isolated parts of the state, past abandoned farmhouses and overgrown cotton fields that hadn't been worked in decades. Those houses wore their histories plain, roofs sagging, porches caved, a chair or two still guarding a door nobody would open. The small towns he'd passed through were dark and silent, their main streets lined with boarded-up storefronts and rusted gas station signs that advertised prices from another era. Silence is persuasive. It convinces you you're the only one awake. It was the kind of landscape that time had forgotten, where cell phone towers were rare and the nearest help might be 50 minutes away. I wasn't out there looking for trouble. Ray was about 20 minutes outside of a town called Millerville when he saw the flashing lights ahead. I've always been a cautious man, but flashing red is a language that says stop before you start thinking. At first, he thought it might be a police roadblock or an accident scene, but as he got closer, he realized it was an ambulance parked on the shoulder of the highway. The road curved like it was trying to hide the scene. The emergency vehicle's red and white strobes painted the surrounding trees in alternating colors, creating a surreal light show in the darkness. Ray slowed his truck and pulled alongside the ambulance, expecting to see paramedics working on an accident victim or perhaps loading someone into the back of the vehicle. Expectation is how predators herd us. Instead, he saw a single EMT standing beside the open rear doors, waving frantically at his truck. I rolled the window, taste of sap and metal in my mouth. The man appeared to be in his 30s, wearing the standard uniform of a rural emergency medical service, and his face was etched with what looked like genuine desperation. I learned that night that desperation can be worn like cologne. Ray rolled down his window and called out, "You need help? I can call for backup on my CB." He jogged over, boots firm, voice shaped by the county. "Thank God you stopped," he said. his voice carrying a thick Alabama accent. "I've got a critical patient in the back, but my engine died and my radio's not working. I can get this guy to the hospital in Montgomery, but it's 40 miles from here." I scanned the badge, the patches, and everything in place, as if authenticity were a kit you could buy and assemble. Rye looked at the ambulance and noticed that it was an older model, probably from the 1990s, with rust spots around the wheel wells and a paint job that had seen better days. Rural equipment ages the way barns do. Slow, honest, visible. That didn't bother me. But something about the situation made Ray's instincts prickle with unease. The unease was a soft pressure under the ribs. The kind of feeling that keeps truckers alive. "What's wrong with your patient?" Rye asked, trying to get a better look at the interior of the ambulance. "Car accident about 10 mi back," the EMT replied. "Single vehicle rolled over in a ditch. Drivers got internal bleeding and possible spinal injuries. I managed to stabilize him, but he needs surgery within the hour or he's not going to make it." Time limits are a leash. Once they snap on, you stop asking certain questions. Ray could see a figure lying on a gurney inside the ambulance, covered with a white sheet up to the neck. Wires, tubes, the geometry of care arranged in neat lines. Everything seemed legitimate, but something about the EMT's demeanor was setting off alarm bells in Ray's subconscious. I have never trusted bells I couldn't see. "Why don't you call for another ambulance?" Rye suggested. "Surely there's backup available." He shook his head too quickly, like he had practiced how to deny hope. "Closest unit is over an hour away, and this guy doesn't have that kind of time. Look, I know it's an unusual request, but could you give us a ride? Your truck's big enough to carry the gurney in the trailer, and I can monitor the patient during transport." He didn't know my trailer was full, or he didn't care. Both answers were bad. Ray hesitated. His trailer was loaded with automotive parts, leaving no room for a gurney. And he wasn't sure his insurance would cover transporting medical patients. More importantly, something about the EMT story didn't add up. I replayed the last 10 miles. If there had been a serious accident 10 miles back, why hadn't Ray seen any evidence of it? No skid marks, no debris, no other emergency vehicles responding to the scene. I felt the leash he'd tossed begin to tighten. "I don't think that's going to work," Ray said carefully. "My trailer's full and I'm not equipped for medical transport. Why don't I call ahead to Montgomery and have them send another ambulance to meet you halfway?" The pitch of his face changed. The EMT's expression changed subtly, and Ray caught a glimpse of something cold and calculating behind the man's eyes. "That's not going to work either," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "This patient needs immediate transport by mile, and you're the only option available." That was when I recognized authority without obligation. A uniform can be armor, it can also be camouflage. I slid my hand toward the door panel where a pistol slept more lightly than I did. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you. I'll call for backup on my CB." His next words were not loud. They didn't need to be. "And you're going to help us," the EMT interrupted, and now his voice carried an authority that seemed to bypass Ray's conscious mind and speak directly to his nervous system. "You're going to pull your truck over to that rest area up ahead, and you're going to do exactly what I tell you to do." It hit like a pressure wave, not sound, not suggestion, more like gravity shifting its angle. My foot eased off the throttle without asking me. My hands turned the wheel. The body is a loyal animal. It obeys the thing that feels most like survival. And in that moment, his voice felt like the only road left. Ray felt a strange compulsion to comply, as if his hands were no longer under his own control. He found himself slowing the truck and looking for the rest area the EMT had mentioned, even though every rational thought in his head was screaming at him to drive away as fast as possible. The pull-off appeared as if conjured by instruction. The rest area turned out to be nothing more than a dirt pull-off with a few picnic tables and an outhouse that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. I turned in, not because I intended to, but because intention had been temporarily outsourced. Ray pulled his truck into the small lot, his movements feeling mechanical and disconnected from his will. The EMT followed in the ambulance, parking close enough to Ray's truck that escape would be difficult. When I twisted the key and killed the engine, the spell thinned like a current dropping under the fingers. Control returned the way circulation does after a long compression, sharp, then throbbing. As soon as Ray shut off his engine, the compulsion broke and he regained control of his actions. He immediately reached for his CB radio, but found that it was producing nothing but static. His cell phone showed no signal, and his satellite emergency beacon wasn't responding to his attempts to activate it. I learned something precious in that instant. Redundancy is only as good as the one thing you didn't plan for. There are outages, and then there are silences engineered to look like outages. The EMT appeared at Ray's driver's side window, no longer bothering to maintain his helpful facade. "Get out of the truck," he commanded. I didn't move. The pistol felt heavier, not reassuring, just honest about what it could and couldn't solve. "What do you want?" Ray asked, his hand gripping his pistol, but not yet drawing it. "We want you to join our patient." The EMT replied with a smile that revealed teeth that were too sharp and too numerous for a human mouth. "He's been asking for company, and we think you'd be perfect for the role. Denial is a survival trick with a short battery." My mind tried to file those teeth under poor lighting, under tricks of shadow, under anything. Then the rear doors opened wider. Ray looked toward the ambulance and saw that the rear doors were now open, revealing the interior in all its horrifying detail. What he had mistaken for medical equipment was actually a collection of restraints, surgical instruments, and monitoring devices that looked more suited to torture than treatment. The instruments shone with the kind of cleanliness that insults a conscience. The figure on the gurney was indeed a patient, but not the kind Ray had expected. The man strapped to the gurney was conscious and aware, his eyes wide with terror as he struggled against the leather restraints that held him in place. Those eyes didn't plead. They advised. His body was covered with surgical incisions that had been made with clinical precision, and tubes and wires ran from various wounds to machines that hummed with electronic life. "He's been with us for 3 days now," the EMT explained conversationally. "We've learned so much from him about human physiology, about pain tolerance, about the limits of consciousness, but he's starting to wear out, and we need fresh material for our research." The word research did not land. It floated like a lie that had learned the vocabulary of truth. Ray drew his pistol and pointed it at the EMT, but the man didn't seem concerned by the weapon. "Research into what?" Ray demanded. "The intersection of medicine and suffering." The EMT replied, "We're exploring the boundaries between life and death, between healing and harm. It's fascinating work, really. Most people don't appreciate the artistry involved in keeping someone alive while systematically dismantling their body. I had nothing to say to that. Some statements are not arguments, they are doors closing." More figures emerged from the ambulance, all wearing medical uniforms, but moving with a coordination that suggested they weren't entirely human. They carried instruments that looked like a cross between surgical tools and medieval torture devices, and their faces held expressions of clinical detachment that were somehow more terrifying than outright malice. They didn't look at me the way hunters look at prey. They looked at me the way surveyors look at land, measurable, purchasable, subdividable. Ray realized that he had stumbled into the territory of something that used the cover of emergency medical services to hunt for victims. The ambulance was their mobile laboratory, allowing them to conduct their experiments while moving from location to location to avoid detection. "You're not EMT," Ray said, backing toward his truck while keeping his weapon trained on the group. "Oh, but we are," the leader replied. "We're just not the kind that saves lives. We're the kind that studies them, that explores the full range of human experience from birth to death and everything in between." They closed in, and I recognized the choreography. No wasted motion, no adrenaline sloppiness. I aimed for the leader's face. Not because I thought it would disable him, but because some symbols deserved to be challenged. Ray climbed back into his truck and tried to start the engine, but nothing happened when he turned the key. The dead click of a machine that should never be quiet. The electrical system was completely dead. As if something had drained all power from his vehicle, the lights on their equipment stayed bright, powered by a principle I didn't want to understand. Through his windshield, he could see the fake EMTs approaching with their instruments, moving with the patient confidence of predators who had done this many times before. I made a choice informed less by courage than by geometry, in desperation. Rai kicked out his passenger window and climbed through the opening. Dropping to the ground on the far side of his truck, pain mapped my shin to a new country. It kept me honest and moving. The woods are democratic. They accept, conceal, refuse to certify anyone's identity. I ran toward the line of trees that had watched this rest area pretend to be rest. He could hear the creatures moving around the vehicle, Titi, searching for him with the methodical efficiency of experienced hunters. Ray ran toward the tree line, hoping to lose himself in the Alabama woods until dawn brought the possibility of rescue. Behind him, he could hear the fake EMTs coordinating their search, their voices carrying an inhuman quality that suggested they weren't using normal vocal cords to communicate. I didn't look back. Looking back is for when you want names and faces, wanted distance and angles. The forest was dense and dark, filled with the sounds of nocturnal creatures that seemed to fall silent as Ray crashed through the underbrush. I chose a line not because it was clear, but because it wasn't. He could hear his pursuers following, moving through the trees with a grace that suggested they were more at home in the wilderness than on the highways. The ambulance was only the storefront. Their true shop was any place without witnesses. I tried to navigate by slope and water. A swale means runoff means a creek means a road, sooner or later. The trick is surviving the sooner. I kept low, kept quiet, kept my breath from giving me away. My mind did inventory, knife, pistol with limited rounds, lighter, no signal more, a headlamp I would not use, a body already making promissory notes to pain payable in the morning. They didn't shout. Ray ran for what felt like hours, his lungs burning and his legs aching from the unaccustomed exercise. Every shadow could hide one of the creatures. Every sound could signal their approach. He had no idea where he was going or how he would get back to civilization, but staying ahead of his pursuers was his only chance of survival. I found a fallen pine, crawled beneath, masked my outline with needles, forced my breathing to imitate a man asleep who had never known fear. The world waited with me. What they wanted, beyond tissue and reactions, was instruction, to teach me my place in their system. Refusing to be taught is a kind of prayer. I stayed in that prayer until the sky traded one shade for another, and the birds decided it was safe to be birds again. As dawn began to break through the canopy, Ray found himself at the edge of a small town that wasn't on any map he'd ever seen. The town had the look of a stage left standing after the actors had quit. The streets were empty, the houses looked abandoned, and there was no sign of normal human activity, yet wires still ran into houses, and the grass knew enough to stay short. But there was a gas station with a payphone, and Rai used his last quarters to call 911. I dialed and waited for a voice that sounded like policy. The dispatcher who answered seemed confused by Ray's location and his story about fake EMTs with a mobile torture chamber. I explained with the simplicity fear grants. Ambulance, not an ambulance, and in uniforms that are not men, a patient who is considered a lesson. I gave coordinates the old way, crossroads, landmarks, a creek. The confusion on the other end felt practiced. I stayed visible. Hiding invites certain kinds of interventions. Standing in the open says you are ready for witnesses. When the state car pulled up, I let my hands announce me before my voice did. When the state police finally arrived, They found no trace of the ambulance or its occupants. Ray's truck was discovered at the rest area, but it started normally and showed no signs of the electrical problems he'd experienced, and evidence had been scrubbed the way a surgeon preps a field. The official report listed the incident as a possible hallucination brought on by fatigue and stress, and no investigation was conducted into the existence of the fake medical team. Ray's account was filed away and forgotten, just another trucker's tall tale about strange encounters on remote highways. That kind of forgetting is a system, too. It keeps certain machines running. I went back to work the way a person returns to a house after bad weather, checking for leaks no one else sees. When he returned to trucking, he started avoiding rural routes whenever possible, sticking to major highways with better traffic and communication coverage. He also began carrying more weapons and emergency equipment, preparing for encounters that no safety manual could anticipate. Preparation is not paranoia, it's faith placed in the body's future. The fake EMTs were still out there, still using their mobile laboratory to conduct their horrific experiments on unsuspecting travelers. They understood human psychology well enough to exploit our instinct to help those in medical distress, and they used the authority of their uniforms to overcome their victims' natural caution. Started telling the story at truck stops, not to trade scares but to trade protocols. We built small rules with big consequences: pull past and observe, verify unit numbers, insist on second responders, never load unknowns into a sealed trailer. Some nodded, some laughed polite, some changed the subject. Ray started warning other truckers about the dangers of stopping for emergency vehicles in remote areas, especially when the situation seemed unusual or the personnel acted strangely. Some drivers listened, but most dismissed his warnings as paranoia or the product of too much time on the road. But the smart ones, the experienced drivers who'd learned to trust their instincts, began questioning emergency situations more carefully and verifying the legitimacy of medical personnel before offering assistance. The smart ones did not become better people. They became harder meals. They understood that the highway was home to predators who wore the uniforms of those who were taught to trust and respect. And somewhere on the back roads of Alabama, an ambulance that isn't really an ambulance continues to prowl the darkness, searching for its next research subject inside its sterile interior. The tools of healing have been perverted into instruments of torture, and the oath to do no harm has been replaced with a dedication to exploring the darkest aspects of human suffering. The road never sleeps, and neither do the things that hunt along its edges, wearing the faces of those who are supposed to help us in our darkest hours. I don't end with a warning. Warnings are for storms you can see on radar. I end with a method. Slow once, but not within arm's reach. Read the unit like a ledger. Keep your engine committed to leaving. Remember that help, like hunger, travels. I left that report in a cabinet where files go to be ignored and started building a religion out of habits. The first commandment, never stop within arm's reach of anything that asks you to hurry. The second, treat uniforms as costumes until proven otherwise. The third, collect patterns the way a storm chaser reads skies. A pattern is a promise. Break enough promises, and you become a believer. I sat with old road mentors at a diner where the coffee tasted like it had done a tour in each driver's thermos before returning to the pot. Carl, who had aged into the shape of a good steering wheel, listened while I laid out what I'd seen. An ambulance with equipment arranged like a sermon. A voice that turned will into suggestion. A town that existed the way a rumor does. You aren't crazy, he said, studying the condensation ring under his cup like it might spell latitude and longitude. You've just been introduced to a different set of rules. We spend our lives on the surface of roots. Sometimes the roots climb over chambers we weren't meant to open. I asked if he'd ever felt an order that wasn't an order, so much as a reconfiguration of gravity. He nodded in a way that made it clear he'd decided, years ago, to lose that memory somewhere quiet. You treat it like weather, he said. Respect distance, build shelter, don't argue with it. If you study it long enough, you can outwait it. Predators want a harvest, not a siege. I began practicing the pass and park method. Never brake the first time I saw emergency strobes. I'd roll by slow, watch for secondary units, watch for the geometry of a true incident, fire extinguisher residue, glass scatter, tread scarring, mark out paint, triage tarps, traffic management protocols, counterfeiters copy symbols, not sequences. Real incidents look messy in a disciplined way. Fake ones are tidy like a stage. On a side leg, near Pine Flats and a derelict cotton gin, I watched another ambulance idling where the night collects. I didn't stop. I passed, circled 3 miles ahead, pulled into a way station turned unmanned. The ambulance left its shoulder, drifted to the next turnout, and waited there instead. No distress, just patience. Predators with schedules usually prefer choke points. This one preferred solitude and repetition. It wasn't trying to catch a target, it was inviting worship. I carried an RF scanner and learned the local emergency traffic the way birders learn calls. County dispatch had a rhythm all its own. Addresses recited with the same tired ceremony. Unit numbers that belonged to aging fleets and budgets that forgave nothing. Periodically, I'd hear a hole where a response should be. An incident called, silence in return. And then the incident resolved itself without transport or report. Holes are maps if you collect enough of them. When I finally returned to the town that wasn't a town, I did it in daylight, which is just another version of dark if you're looking for the kind of people who need shadows to feel comfortable. The streets were in better condition than the buildings deserved. Lawns that cut themselves, windows without dust, a library with no books, and a ledger with no dates. I parked where a payphone used to be and found the metal plate still warm. If you tell yourself it's the sun, you don't have to ask who last touched it. An older woman ran a shop that sold nothing but staples. She watched me study the shelf like I was deciding what kind of man to be. "I've not seen your rig before," she said. And the sentence wasn't a question. Said I'd passed through at night once. She shook her head, not in denial, but in pity. "The road takes and the road gives. This place is what it gives when it has taken too much. It's a landing for people who didn't quite land. Well, you belong to distance, and distance doesn't share." I asked if she'd seen ambulances. "Not the kind you want to wave down," she said. "They visit when we are quietest. They don't buy anything. They study displays." She tapped the counter twice as if blessing the next words. "When you meet a collector, you learn to stop offering yourself for appraisal." I left the town with the kind of careful backing you use when you've parked at the edge of a cliff and forgot for a moment that cliffs are patient. And somewhere between that shop and the state road, I decided I'd move from caution to countermeasure. Someone had to. I started building a fellowship of drivers who understood that surviving is a craft. We called it a protocol because that felt less like a club and more like a set of tools left out for whoever needed them. The rules were simple and hard. Pass and park. Verify unit identifiers with dispatch through a number you bring, not the one they offer. Observe equipment for sequence. Not shininess. No assistance rendered unless you can place at least 2 independent agencies on scene. If anything tries to compress your time, make more of it. The group grew in the way good rumors grow, from one mouth carrying something that tasted like help to another mouth tired of pretending fear isn't heavy. We shared stories about false breakdowns, staged in the shadow of billboards, about vehicles that always seemed to stall at the same boundary sign, about voices on the radio that didn't use channels so much as the mind's attention. One woman, Leah, who hauled dry goods with the grace of someone who had once carried grief, said a voice once told her to step away from her wheel and wait inside a specific restroom. She felt her kneecaps agree before she remembered to say no. She drove past, found a deputy 2 exits later, returned with him, and discovered the restroom's door propped with a tire iron and the lights on without a switch in sight. We didn't call the things chasing us names. Names invite. Names stake claims. We described behaviors, fascination with remote locations, curatorial tidiness, a talent for reducing autonomy to a setting on a dial. We charted where signals died early, where roadside phones were still maintained in an age that had stopped believing in them, where the maintenance line on a county map disagreed with the asphalt beneath our tires. Our charts began to resemble fishing maps more than road atlases, eddies, shelves, sudden depths. I bought a used box trailer with a power system isolated from my rig, batteries that owed nothing to the alternator, a small generator with a mechanical governor, a switch panel mounted in a shielded locker. I lined a section with conductive mesh like a Faraday pocket because I wanted to know whether authority that climbed the spine could also be asked to wait at the door. I stocked cameras with internal storage that couldn't transmit, lights that didn't care if someone else commanded the air, and an old printer that only knew the language of paper. The plan, when it finally presented itself, wasn't elaborate so much as stubborn. Off a bait, a rig pulled just off a secondary road where anyone could claim to be passing. Stage vulnerability, hood up, reflective triangles set with textbook correctness. Keep distance. A second rig, Carl's, parked a half-mile beyond with clear sightline through oaks that knew how to keep secrets. Build redundancy. 2 radios we trusted, but also a written schedule of what to do when radio trust failed. Leave nothing in the plan that couldn't be performed by a man alone, because that's how bad nights tend to go. It didn't take long for a unit to answer a scene we hadn't announced. White over red, older body, discreet weathering in all the places where rust qualifies as nostalgia. The ambulance coasted in front first, which made no sense tactically if the crew expected to load anything. It faced us like someone who wanted to see disappointment clearly. The rear doors stayed closed at first, then cracked enough to suggest promise. A figure approached with the same economy I remembered. The uniform didn't crease where real uniforms crease, that's a small tell. But once you've seen it, it glows. He didn't wave immediately. He let me wave first. This time, I didn't. I stood beside my engine, like we were 2 neighbors sharing the same property line and a problem with deer.
Trouble? He asked.
Routine, I said. Heat soak and patience usually solves it. Step back. Let me take a look. Appreciate the offer, I said, and meant nothing by it. He peered into a compartment, as if it were a display in a museum dedicated to combustion. We can get you to a shop, he said. We're headed that way.
I'm waiting on another unit, I said. They'll be here soon. He didn't like that. Not the delay, but the plural. Plural means witnesses. He offered a shape of smile I remembered too well. We can handle it quicker.
I believe you, I said. Belief can be a weapon when you hold it by the right end. I pointed behind me at the trailer. I've got cold storage in there for perishables. If you think we should move the sensitive freight, we can stage it inside your unit for a minute while I finish the reset. He considered whether my suggestion was submission or test. Predators collect compliance like trophies. I wasn't handing him one. I was asking him to step into a corridor I had built. He signaled, and the rear doors opened. The interior was immaculate, and immaculate is a confession if you've ever seen what real care looks like under pressure. Straps, restraints, cabinets in perfect alignment, a gurney waiting without a mattress. As if comfort were evidence, he gestured with a gloved hand toward the threshold. I lifted a crate and walked forward until the toe of my boot touched the invisible border I'd mapped a dozen times in rehearsal. Metal met mesh. I spoke a sentence I'd practiced until it felt like a posture. Before I cross your line, I want you to cross mine. He tilted his head, and somewhere behind his eyes, a lens narrowed. Meaning? I pointed to a painted square on the pavement, 2 feet inside my trailer's open door. Step there, just for a count. Then I'll bring this in. He didn't step. Predators have rules too. The first is never to volunteer for someone else's geometry. He glanced up the road and then past me to where he felt the distant attention of a second truck. His voice softened the air, reaching for my vertebrae like an old friend. You're overthinking. Set the crate down and follow me. I felt that gravity shift again. The one that makes your joints remember they were children once and liked obeying, but I had spent months preparing a place where even gravity had to file paperwork. I stood inside the mesh-lined threshold of my trailer, and the pressure held outside like rain against a window. He felt it too. His face didn't dim. It adjusted. "We can wait together," I said. "My friend will be here soon." He made a choice. He didn't retreat. He called it patience. I called it escalation. Escalation wears professionalism the way a blade wears polish. Another figure exited the unit, carrying a case that might once have belonged to medicine and now served a different liturgy. They conferred without speech that I could hear. I watched their coordination and thought about the word practice. Practice makes permanent, not perfect. They had practiced this scene, or scenes like it, enough to know where to stand when a man refused to cross a threshold. I moved 3 steps into my trailer and pulled a panel I'd built with the stubborn attention of a carpenter who knows what it means to try to make a house safe in a wind that disrespects houses. The panel revealed a switch no outsider could name and a window cut the size of a phone screen. Through that window, I watched them watch me. I closed the trailer door until only a seam remained and thumbed the switch. The generator, buried in its insulated bay, changed its tone to nothing anyone else could command. The mesh grounded the air into something uninteresting, like the inside of a storm shelter before the storm remembers you. I spoke into a wired handset that owed allegiance to copper and not to the sky. "Carl, begin record," I said. I opened the seam and let the day enter again. The lead stepped closer. "This is unnecessary," he said. "We're here to help." "Help looks different from authority," I said. "Show me your unit number painted under dirt that didn't arrive yesterday. Show me your drug box seals broken and repaired by hands that tremble for ordinary reasons. Show me a wipe stain where someone cried and you didn't know where to put the compassion, so you put it on your sleeve, or compassion is a language they don't speak. They learn the nouns but not the verbs." He studied me the way a surveyor studies a line he intends to redraw. "You don't want me to insist," he said. And the word insist made my teeth remember the rest area where I had once mistaken compliance for mercy.
"I don't want you to," I said, "but want has nothing to do with this."
Behind him, the second figure flicked a latch on the case, and I understood that their tools were less about cutting and more about appraising. They measured responses, not tissue. They waited for my skin to confess allegiance. I offered them more time instead. Carl's rig rolled into view. Not fast, not slow, like a sermon delivered to people who are tired but still listening. He parked precisely where we had chalked his tire marks the night before. He did not exit. He did not offer conversation. Witnessing was enough. The lead turned to look, then back to me with that same almost smile. 2 to 1 won't change the study, he said.
"You're right," I said. "We need more."
Leah came next, hauling a short trailer that carried nothing but a pallet and a sense of responsibility. She parked behind Carl, angled so her dash camera could see the unit's license plates and my face. 3 is a crowd. 3 is also a quorum. The lead didn't back away. He did something else. He opened his hands, as if to show that he carried no weapon, which is the kind of gesture you use in rooms where everyone has already decided what a weapon is. His weapon wore a voice. "Let's simplify," he said. And the words, "let's simplify," tried to put my mind in a hallway that narrowed until the only exit was the one he controlled. The push met the mesh and failed to announce itself. I saw, for the first time, not malice in his eyes, but a calculation about effort and return. Predators move on when a field proves barren. That should have comforted me. It didn't, because the rear doors opened wider, and I saw a second interior past the first, not an optical trick, a compartment after the compartment, as if dimension were flexible when you wore the right uniform. In that second space, a man sat upright on a gurney that looked more like a pew. His eyes were dry and aware. He wore no restraints. He did not move. He was being kept there by a promise I couldn't hear. I think they meant me to see him. Curiosity is a hook we attach to ourselves. They wanted me to step closer on my own. Instead, I said to the lead, "Let him walk out. No ceremony, no arrangement. Just let him walk out, and I'll bring you anything you ask that doesn't belong to a person." The lead considered. "He is mid-series, he said. "We don't interrupt series." He said the word series the way scholars say canon, "but you can join the next." "I already joined," I said. I just didn't learn the lesson you taught." We held there, my rig humming inside its little pocket of refusal, their unit broadcasting a patience designed to be misread as virtue. Finally, the lead closed his hands and gave a signal I failed to decode. The second figure stepped back into the unit, and the double interior folded into itself without noise, as if the idea of space had changed its mind. This is where stories usually offer a victory or a loss. We got neither. They left. Not fast, not defeated. They left, the way a teacher leaves a classroom when the bell rings and the students have managed to keep one secret for a whole period. The road took them and returned to its ordinary testimony about distance. I felt relief pretend to be wisdom. Leah approached with a look that asked for a tally. "We didn't save him," she said. "No accusation, just accounting." "No," I said. "We altered the study," which is the kind of sentence that keeps you up until sleep turns honest. Altering a study isn't the same as ending it. A week later, the protocol discovered that one of the holes on our RF maps had migrated. Outages don't move. Nets do. The hole drifted toward a service road that carried utility trucks and the occasional church convoy. It parked itself beside a lake that pretended to be natural. We watched night cover the parking lot and counted vehicles that arrived with too much intention. We decided on a second operation, not because we thought we could win, but because there are nights when the only way to be a person is to disagree with the arithmetic. The arrangement this time involved a trailer rigged with induction loops under the flooring, powered by a bank that could run a small house without asking the sky for permission. The loops weren't designed to stop anything supernatural. They were designed to confuse timing, because timing is what a command rides to reach a body. When the unit arrived, click on it. It did not play at being stranded. It paraded, doors open, lights beating a heartbeat that did not belong to it. Attendants in perfect file. They set out a cot on the asphalt and arranged instruments that gleamed like an argument about ethics. Then they waited, and 4 cars within sight of the lake decided they had seen enough invitation to start approaching. Not everyone who answers a predator's call is a fool, and some are merely available. I stepped out before the cars could offer themselves. "With me," I said to the first man, who wore the look of someone who has built his life on saying yes. I didn't speak like authority. I spoke like a fellow parishioner. He hesitated, which is all a person needs to remember they have legs. The lead recognized me. His smile registered approval the way a curator praises a donor before the plaque is mounted. "Back again," he said. "Some places don't let you leave without a souvenir," I said. "I came to return mine." Carl's rig blocked the exit. Leah's rig blocked the lake access. We had no weapons on display because steel gives the wrong kind of permission to certain kinds of men. Our permission looked like paperwork and time. We placed cones that meant nothing but looked official. We measured nothing with a clipboard that reminded the brain of procedures. Authority isn't only a voice, it's props. We borrowed their theatre. The lead produced a badge for a county that does not exist. Number engraved with exactness. I produced a laminated sheet no one had authorized, a checklist for a joint operations drill. I read line items aloud in a tone meant for tired rooms. Unit inspection, crew credential review, equipment, serial verification, randomized patient release. The last item was an invention that sounded like bureaucracy. Bureaucracy can be its own kind of magic if you let it. I pointed at the man seated beyond the first interior. Randomized release. Him. The lead looked at me with the calm of a field that has watched 200 storms and considers itself the winner either way. "You aren't qualified to ask," he said.
"I'm not asking," I said. "I'm documenting."
That word reached into his playbook. Predators don't fear force, they fear context. Context is a story that outlives a night. He tilted his chin. Minuscule. And the second figure fetched a device that might take measurements or make them. I didn't wait. I stepped within my trailer's arc of loops I had laid earlier, tethered by a cable disguised as an extension cord. The pressure came, steady, seeking my hinge points, and met the loops. It didn't stop. It staggered. A man can do a lot in a stagger. I talked, loud enough for their cameras, yes, they keep records, to collect the right phrases: joint operation, patient welfare check, release to independent custody for third-party assessment. The words changed the air. Words can do that. The lead's mouth made a shape I hadn't seen. Not frustration, not surprise, calculation without an answer. Leah and Carl rolled pallets forward. Not because pallets belong in an ambulance scene, but because the brain relaxes when it sees forklifts and straps. Ordinary life disarms monsters. We wheeled ordinary into their cathedral and waited to see if their religion could tolerate secular. The man on the inner gurney turned his face toward me, and in that face I saw not terror but a decision waiting for its sentence. I said, "Walk." I didn't say please. Please is for rooms where kindness is the currency. This was an economy of choices. He stood. It looked brief and infinite. He stepped forward once, twice, and at the threshold the air thickened like a rule disappointed at being broken. I reached, not touching him, just holding up a hand the way you hold up a hand to a dog that has never known faultless owners. He kept stepping. He exited into light that belonged to no one present. The attendants did not attack. They reconfigured. The instruments didn't slice. They recorded. We were being added to a ledger we would never read. The lead spoke like a judge, entering a sentence that would happen in increments. "You think you saved him," he said. "No," I said. I offered him a different conclusion. Some lives end inside the same body they began in. Others migrate while feet are still in motion. Either way, a man is entitled to stand once at a threshold and choose. We escorted him past our rigs and into a car that belonged to no plan, an off-duty deputy who had come at Leah's text and stayed because curiosity is a species of courage. The deputy didn't flash any lights. He drove like the road had entrusted him with a secret that needed miles to settle. The ambulance didn't pursue. Predators who run risk looking like thieves instead of scientists. They packed their instruments with etiquette and closed their doors, for the last door shut. The lead said a sentence to me that I have not finished hearing. "We don't stop. We don't sleep. We don't hate you for interfering. Hate is waste." They left the lot as if the lake had called them back to a syllabus. Our equipment recorded nothing remarkable. Shadows behaving like shadows, frequencies behaving like frequencies, to anyone who didn't stand there. We had an ordinary night with a strange ambulance and bad lighting. That is how most victories arrive. Quiet, almost deniable. Later, when I tried to sleep, my mind replayed not the man stepping free, but the second interior folding like a document returned to a file no one will request. The image taught me something I hadn't wanted to know. There are rooms inside uniforms. You can line your trailer with mesh, but the body you carry is the oldest room you own. And some voices know the way in. So I changed the protocol again. New commandments. Practice saying no in the mirror until the word learns your posture. Never let desire to be helpful vote against your survival. When faced with a choice between immediate kindness and documented caution, choose the kind that leaves a trail. I still haul parts between cities that pretend they will survive forever. I still share coffee with men and women who know the taste of ours. I still pass ambulances and see both mercy and method. I don't slow the first time. I circle and watch and give my better angels a longer runway. When I do stop, I park where witnesses are cheap and distance is expensive. And if you ever find yourself on a road that feels like it was laid across an old promise, and an ambulance waits where no one waits long without a reason, remember this: not every study deserves a subject. Some uniforms don't keep oaths. Some oaths were never written for people. Walk past the first invitation. Build your own threshold. Let help, like hunger, travel alone unless it can show you its receipts. That's my ending. Not a warning. Warnings are weather reports for storms that have already formed. But a method I offer, like a tool, left on a workbench at the end of a shift. You don't owe anyone your obedience at the edge of a quiet road. The road belongs to distance. And distance, despite rumors, still belongs to those who keep moving. Story number 11. The smell of gasoline always stayed with me. In my clothes, in my dreams, in my fear. But that day, it clung to the air like a warning. You don't expect death at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday, but when your brakes vanish on a mountain pass with 8,000 gallons of fuel behind you, expectation doesn't matter. I had 22 years behind the wheel. That day, every mile I'd driven suddenly meant nothing, because nothing had prepared me for this. They say some men die in bed, others die with their boots on. I was about to die in a firestorm that could have taken out an entire town, but it didn't have to. There are moments when a man has to choose, save himself or save everyone else. That decision found me barreling down Rabbit's Ear Pass with no brakes, no hope, and no time. I always checked the brakes at the summit. That morning was no different. The gauges were green, the air tanks full, but something wasn't right. I felt it in my spine, the way seasoned drivers do, and yet I pushed on. The descent began smooth. The sun was shining. The radio had a classic country station humming in the background, and then I touched the pedal. I tapped the brake and felt nothing. No pressure, no resistance, just air. I tried again. Nothing. My foot went all the way to the floor. I looked up, and the slope ahead stretched like a death wish. The tanker, fully loaded with gasoline, was already picking up speed. This wasn't just mechanical failure. This was fate dropping a match. I knew instantly what was at stake. 80,000 pounds of mass, accelerating, and I wasn't hauling furniture. I was sitting on a bomb. My CB lit up before I could even process. Eastbound tanker, you're coming down that hill too fast. You good? I grabbed the mic. Negative. Total brake failure. Loaded with fuel. I'm doing 70 and climbing. Get 'em clear, brother. Panic was not an option. When you're the problem on the road, you can't afford to freeze. Truckers are a strange breed, say. We spend weeks alone, but act like family when it counts. Within minutes, voices filled the channel. Warnings, reroutes, encouragement. Mike, this is Charlie in the blue Peterbilt. We're with you, man. Just keep her straight.
Charlie, a voice I'd heard before. Years of crossing paths on I-80, I-15, the Salt Lake lines. Familiar? Steady?
But steady wouldn't stop gravity. My hands gripped the wheel as the road twisted. Below, I could see the town, a school, a strip mall, a gas station. The idea of what would happen if I crashed there made my stomach turn. I scanned ahead. No runaway ramp, no flat stretch, just a drop and a curve.
Charlie, I said, breath catching. If this goes bad, call my wife. Tell her I was thinking of her. Don't talk like that, Mike. We're going to figure this out.
But I knew I'd already passed the point of no return. This wasn't about figuring it out. It was about choosing how it ends. 2 miles ahead, past a service turnoff, the map in my head flashed an option, an embankment, sharp, rocky, dead-end canyon, no people, just boulders and trees. A graveyard waiting to be used.
I smiled bitterly. He didn't understand. This wasn't giving up. This was choosing where the fire lands me.
I took a deep breath, pulled the family photo off the dash and stared at it for a second. Halloween, my son dressed as a dinosaur, my daughter with butterfly wings.
I wasn't going to be the reason their world burned. Literally,
The speedometer ticked past 85. I could hear the strain of the engine, but I kept it centered in final mile. I keyed the mic. Charlie, if she hears from you, tell her I didn't die scared. Tell my kids their dad made a choice. I let go of the mic. Time was up. As I yanked the steering wheel, the tanker lunged to the right. The world tilted, and for a split second, we were airborne. And then, a shock. The kind that doesn't register in pain, but in finality. The tanker slammed into the rocky slope. The fuel ignited instantly. The mountain lit up. They said the explosion was seen from over 60 miles away. It made the news before they even found the crater. No casualties reported.
because I didn't hit the town because I made that turn.
Charlie pulled into the next truck stop. He wasn't alone. Dozens of others had followed it all, silent partners to a man who made a hard choice. They lit candles, bought coffee no one drank, stood in a silence deeper than grief. In memory of Mike Thompson, who chose to save others rather than himself. That's what the plaque says now, bolted next to the diesel pump at mile marker 117. My wife got the call, and the letters, hundreds of them, teachers, parents, people from the town below who had no idea what rolled above them that day. They made safety videos with my story, not for drama, but to teach responsibility. New drivers sit through simulations now. A fictional Mike stares down a hill, blinking gauges, silent brakes, and instructors ask, "What would you do?" Some try to jump out, others say they'd crash sooner, but a few understand that the worst decisions are the ones that save lives at the cost of your own. The canyon became a shrine not because I died there, but because others didn't.
The smell of gasoline no longer haunts me. It comforts me because I know where it didn't go.
Story number 12. I told myself the storm was just weather, not a message. Snow is honest, it falls where it must. Yet the night took that honesty and made it into a corridor, a single pale ribbon with teeth on either side. I have hauled timber long enough to read mountains like a tired novel. Ridges speak in gradients. Frost writes its warnings on glass. And tires translate the truth, but some nights refuse translation. The road says go, your bones say turn back. I was alone by choice, or so I thought. I used to believe solitude was a shield, fewer voices to distract, fewer mistakes to make. Then something leaned close to that idea and breathed on it until it fogged. The mirrors began lying first. A shadow would appear, then erase itself when I checked. As if the truck were followed by thoughts instead of shapes. I blinked and saw patterns sliding between the trees, too smooth, too sure, too patient.
By the time I named my fear, it had already learned my route. And that was when the night became a plan.
I kept the rig steady, tires knitting a path through drifts that wanted to become walls. I talked myself down from the ledge of panic by repeating the dull, practical truths of a driver's life. Fuel, temperature, chain tension, brake feel. The litany helped, but it didn't erase the way the timber pressed and shifted behind me like a crowded pew in an empty church. I had left the last town miles back and stepped into the blank country where maps are more promise than proof. Ahead, the pass pitched and folded like a sleeping animal. On the left, the ravine, a dark breath that kept pace with me even when the truck slowed for a curve, and on the right, trees stacked themselves into a tribunal. Their verdict was time, and the sentence was distance. I have learned to trust unease. It is the only instrument in the cab that never shorts. At first, it brushed my shoulders like static. Then it settled. Then it rooted. You are not alone. I didn't say it out loud. I didn't have to. I felt watched the way you feel, A fever before the thermometer agrees. I angled the mirrors, dimmed the dash, cut the cab light. The world pulled tight around the windshield and waited. A phrase rose up in my head, not mine, but fitting, like a road sign I didn't remember passing. The snow was falling harder now. It wasn't poetry, it was inventory. Behind that truth came another I wanted to ignore, but tonight felt different. I dropped a gear and let the engine hold me on the descent. In the glass, I caught slivers of motion where there should have been none. In his mirrors, he caught glimpses of movement between the snow-laden pines. I shut the thought down. This was my night, my road, but the line kept threading through, as if it belonged here, as if the mountain itself were reading from a record older than me. Shapes flanked the truck, there and not there, dark shapes that seemed to pace his truck, maintaining the same speed despite the difficult terrain.
Please, I don't use the word inhuman lightly, and people will make a religion out of a rumor, but machines and weather don't care what you believe. And still, there I was, telling myself not to name what I saw, because names pull things closer.
My radio sat quiet enough to feel judged. The CB radio had been silent for the past miles, which wasn't unusual in this remote area where mountains blocked most transmissions. I checked the satellite phone and found nothing but a dead icon, and the cell might as well have been a polished stone. I was completely cut off from the outside world. I rounded a hairpin and stunned myself with relief at the plain logic drawn in the snow. Proof. The first direct evidence of my stalkers came when I noticed tracks in the fresh snow alongside the highway. Not deer, not elk, not anything I could put in a category that let me breathe easier. The tracks were enormous, easily 3 times the size of human footprints, and they showed a stride length that suggested something moving at incredible speed. But there are measures you take when evidence forces your hand. I took them. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my loaded truck faster than was safe on the icy mountain road. I have always tried to be the kind of driver who leaves a margin, who returns the truck intact, because the truck returns me intact. That night, the margin melted. I made speed where prudence would have made a call to stop and chain up again. Check the binders, reassess. Courage is often just a late apology to caution. The tracks bred more tracks. What had started as a single set of prints became 2, then 4, then too many to count. Kept the cab warm enough to keep my hands from going stiff, cool enough to keep my brain from turning foggy. There's a point when a driver stops arguing with the night and begins negotiating. I promised nothing out loud. I adjusted my grip, checked the temperature gauge, and set my jaw against the next bend. And the mountain gave me that bend and then took something else. It came without a sound you could record. The air itself felt shouldered aside. The attack came without warning as I navigated a particularly treacherous section of road that wound along the edge of a deep ravine. The glass held. My breath did not. The trailer kinked, thought about folding, then remembered its manners and straightened. In the jittering corner of my visions, a figure kept pace. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but covered in thick, dark fur that glistened with ice crystals. It did not lope, did not lurch. It moved with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. The tree line delivered more of them, as if it had been holding its breath. More creatures emerged from the forest, appearing on both sides of the highway like ghosts materializing from the swirling snow. I counted without meaning to, at least 8, all moving with the same supernatural speed and coordination. The trailer jumped a little, a message in steel. One of the creatures leapt onto my trailer, its claws finding purchase on the metal surface despite the ice and snow. I felt weight translate into handling, a drag, a lag, a persuasion at the edge of control. I kept my hands where they needed to be and let muscle memory hold the line. I reached for the radio anyway, because ritual matters even when it fails. I began broadcasting on the emergency channel, hoping that someone somewhere might pick up my transmission. The thing on the trailer crawled forward with a patience that read like practice. I could see its shadow in my mirrors as it approached the cab. And I realized with growing horror that it was trying to reach my fuel tanks. If it managed to puncture them, I would be stranded in the wilderness with no heat, no power, and no way to escape. I made the truck sway. In desperation, I began swerving back and forth across the highway, trying to shake the creature loose. The tires negotiated with ice and physics. The guardrail marked its presence an arm's length away. I kept the trailer behind me by force of will and a little luck that felt borrowed. The creature held on with inhuman strength, its claws leaving deep gouges in the metal as it fought to maintain its grip. The world will sometimes assemble itself into a lesson if you are willing to learn fast enough. I watched them, watching me. Their timing had gears, their positions had purpose. The creatures weren't just hunting me randomly, they were hurting me, forcing me toward a specific destination. When I tried to imagine an exit, they painted over it. Every time I tried to change direction or take an alternate route, they would appear to block my path, leaving me no choice but to continue on the road they wanted me to travel. There is an art to submission when your only goal is survival. I pretended to comply and led my compliance into a problem only I could solve. These creatures weren't just predators, I told myself not to treat them like myths, treated them like a team. I pushed the truck to its absolute limits. The gauge climbed, the engine gave me what it could, and I promised it gratitude later if we both earned later. They tightened the noose at the top of a long grade, and the night opened its hand to show me the plan. The highway ahead was blocked by a massive, fallen tree that had been deliberately positioned across both lanes, not stormfall. Placement, height measured, angle tested. The creatures had been planning this trap, possibly for days or weeks, waiting for the right victim to come along. I had seconds. A decision that would determine whether I lived or died. Stopping meant disassembly by committee. Ramming meant a broken front end and smoke I couldn't use. There was a third answer hiding in the right-hand margin of the road's page. A flaw in the guardrail where an old logging road dissolved into the dark. I veered toward a narrow opening in the guardrail where an old overgrown logging road disappeared into the forest. The truck took the impact and told me the truth about stress in steel. The impact with the guardrail sent shockwaves through the entire truck. The barrier surrendered. We slid into the unplowed throat of the trees, or my truck plunged into the forest, following the overgrown logging road as it wound deeper into the wilderness. Branches reached and argued along both sides of the trailer. The logging road was barely wide enough for my truck, with branches scraping against both sides of the cab and trailer. The pack tried to flank, but the choke point became a friend. 2 or 3 at a time could test the edges, the rest had to follow in a staggered file. The grade pitched down, then shouldered up again. I kept the weight centered, counted heartbeats by landmarks. Stump, ditch, culvert, bend. There is a quiet that lives under snow, even when predators move. It isn't peace, it's pressure. I stayed ahead by a margin you could measure in the width of a palm. I had no idea where the road led or if it would eventually bring me back to civilization, but staying ahead of my pursuers was my only chance of survival. A light bled through the trees the way hope does when you're almost too tired to notice. The logging road emerged into a clearing where a small ranger station sat dark and apparently abandoned. Beside it, a dish tilted its eye at the sky, and a thin mast held the idea of a signal. There was a satellite dish on the roof and what looked like a radio antenna suggesting that communication equipment might be available. I rolled to a stop, killed the engine, and let the sudden stillness ring in the bones of the truck. I ran. I parked the truck and ran to the station, breaking a window to get inside. The room that received me smelled like cold dust and old paper. The building was cold and dusty, but the radio equipment was still functional. Dials woke to my hands. Lights agreed to be lights. I reached people who could reach me. I managed to raise the Forest Service dispatcher in Coeur de Delaine, who promised to send a search and rescue team to my location. They didn't follow me into the building. I watched back, and I kept the door blocked with a desk. Not because I believed it would stop them, but because symbols matter when you are alone. I stayed awake by writing, not writing like a novelist reaching for beauty, writing like a driver jamming facts into the shape of sentences before fatigue erased them. I wrote down the size of the prints, the way they flowed like a team that had trained together, the patience they learned from winter. I wrote down something I had never admitted to anyone. I had seen eyes like theirs once, reflected in the mirror of a diner window, my own, after too many nights alone. Morning drew the world in charcoal and ash, then added color as if the sky were embarrassed to have been so dramatic. Rescue came at dawn when a Forest Service helicopter spotted my truck and the ranger station. I stepped outside like a person stepping back into a name. The crew found me exhausted, but unharmed. They made the right noises, the right checks, the right notes. They noted the extensive damage to my truck from what appeared to be large claws. The official report blamed the incident on a combination of severe weather, fatigue, and possible wildlife encounters. I don't hold a grudge against paperwork, and paper is where fear goes when it wants to look tidy. But I kept a copy of my own notes. I had written the truth on a desk I pushed against the door, and the truth stayed. I returned to the road with new rules. The creatures were still out there, still hunting, still using the isolation of America's remote wilderness to trap unsuspecting drivers. You don't have to believe me, the road is a teacher and accepts all students, and most importantly, they understood human psychology well enough to exploit our predictable responses to danger. We turn away from the obvious trap and toward the elegant one. We slow when we should surge when we should ghost. We assume the worst danger has claws. Often it has a calendar. I spoke at truck stops in the softer hours when coffee tastes like a plan and daylight makes every story sound less like a warning and more like gossip. Some listened, but most dismissed my warnings as the ravings of a man who'd spent too much time on isolated roads. They understood that the highway was home to predators that no safety manual could prepare you for. There is a forest I no longer name out loud, at somewhere in the Idaho mountains, in a forest where the snow never completely melts. The creatures continue their nocturnal hunts, waiting for the next driver who will venture too far from the safety of civilization. And if you ask me what the forest taught me, I will say this: the wilderness never sleeps, and neither do the things that hunt in its deepest, darkest corners. I still drive on my... The freight changes, the routes bend toward company. The schedules leave room for dawn, and I keep an extra pair of chains and an extra radio. I watch the mirrors, the way a person watches a door he once saw open by itself. When the snow begins to speak in the old, patient vocabulary, I listen with both hands on the wheel and a promise ready on my tongue. If the road lays a trap, I will find the margin again, and I will choose the floor in the guardrail. And if I have to write the truth again on a desk pushed against a door, I will make the letters large enough to read in the dark.